I see that Brother Lihasa is here.
That's good. That's good. Lahasa has finally come on. Okay, so here we're going to start. So what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to ask everyone, Jasmine and Priscilla, I'm going to ask everyone to mute their microphones so that we won't have much noise. And then if they could mute, then I started. Okay, I think everybody is muted. Is that right? Everybody seems to be muted. And so, let's see. Okay, I think, yeah, well, we got good. I just want to make sure everybody is here. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of us who are here. And I want to thank Belinda Wilson, who's been basically our administrator working with us, getting us, making sure that we all be up to par with this webinar. I want to also give thanks to Priscilla Thermidor and Jasmine Evans and Dr. Nadav. Since 1492, when Europeans began to settle in the Americas to eradicate the indigenous populations and to forcibly transport Africans to the Americas, the Western nations have been on a quest to destabilize and disestablish the agency of African people. In South Africa, the arrival of the settlers in 1652 had a similar effect to create confusion among the people, to destabilize the commonly held polity among the people, and to eradicate the long-held traditions of the people. The assault has been frontal, sustained, and violent at physical and psychological levels, using all dominative instruments of language, symbolism, and warfare. The consequences of this war on Africa have been profound, giving rise to doctrines of white supremacy and Black inferiority, African servility, and the negation of African civilization. Two physical attacks on Africa in the form of enslavement and colonization led to the internalization of the idea, even by Africans themselves, that what the West had given to us was correct. So thoroughly was the acceptance of African peripheralization that Europe was successful in convincing the rest of the world that Africa, the mother of humanity and civilization, was a mere child in human civilization terms, when in fact, Homo sapiens arose on the African continent and tamed, civilized, and maintained human existence for 2/3 of the time that Homo sapiens have been on the earth. Thus, African internalization of the lack of agency and the acceptance by other people of a negative narrative about Africa undermine the subject place of African people. The question is, who were we African people without and before the encounter with Europe 500 years ago? Indeed, put more expressly, what were the mechanisms that threw Africa off of its own terms? Who took charge of writing African culture, African religion, African languages? What was the reason that those whose conquest was physical then had to sustain it in their minds and ours in a psychological way? Here is the reason for the split in the theoretical thinking between decolonization and decoloniality. One normally sees decolonization as the way people disengage themselves from occupying people. In effect, when the political control of a people's nation is taken over by the majority, that is the authoritarian majority, we say that it has been decolonized. However, The act of decoloniality is removing the vestiges of colonization from the society. On the other hand, Afrocentricity is the assertion of an African agency in every phenomenon, which answers the question of what do you do once you have done decolonization and decoloniality? Because once you have done decoloniality, the question is, what then are you asserting? So, what I have tried to introduce is the notion, along with my colleagues, the notion of advancing an Afrocentric assertion. And that Afrocentric assertion is a philosophical paradigm that emphasizes the centrality and agency of the African person within a historical and cultural context. And as such, it is a rejection of the historic marginality and racial alterity often expressed in the ordinary ideology of European racial domination, which seeks to desacralize African languages and culture. A new epistemic vision has been advancing already as the postmodern deconstructionists and decolonialists have seen the end of their ideological vision. So I'm very pleased and very happy today to be able to bring together this incredible collection of scholars and this incredible collection of people who have been on the front lines of this battle. And I want to say to you that the way we will proceed with our 10-minute presentations is that I will introduce our speaker, first speaker, and then I will have Dr. Nadav, who is a colleague here. She will introduce a speaker, and then we will do it that way. I introduce one, she introduces one, and then we will finally have everybody speaking. Your CVs or your bios have been shared with other members of the panel. You will have them. We have a final version that we will send to you later because some of them just came in today. So we will have that, we will share that with you. I also want to say that we know the time differences that exist. There are people from California and there are people from Russia and Bangladesh and South Africa. So we're going to try to get through this program as quickly as we can. I'm going to start by introducing a person who is a major in this field and one of the leading thinkers, and I hope that we will have her on. Is Dr. Priscilla, have you seen Dr. Mazama? You need to unmute. Priscilla?
I'm still trying to get Dr. Mazama.
Okay, well, if you don't have Dr. Mazama, then I should go to our first speaker, who will be Abu Saeed Mohammed Noman. And I'm going to ask Dr. Nadav, if she's on, to introduce Dr. Abu Noman. So she is not on. So I will introduce Dr. Noman. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Noman. Dr. Abu Saeed Noman is an assistant professor in the Department of English and Humanities at Brak University in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where he has been teaching since 2010. As a Fulbright scholar, he obtained his second MA in African American Studies from Temple University, and then he received his PhD on Afrocentricity and post-colonialism at Temple University in 2018. Trained in critical Afrocentricity, Dr. Abu addressed both the pedagogical and epistemological crises in post-colonial studies and demonstrated that Afrocentricity can effectively help post-colonial studies resolve some of its pressing issues related to identity agency, and representation. Dr. Abu Noman.
Hello from Bangladesh, and this is a great privilege for me to present this brief talk on Afrocentric epistemology and its application in addressing some of the pedagogical problems in post-colonial studies. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to focus on how English as a discipline perpetuates Western epistemology even today through the academic field called post-colonial studies. And in the second part of my talk, I'll focus on a comparative analysis between Modificati Assante's Afrocentric strategies in asserting one's agency and Edward Said's discourse on Orientalism that otherized the African and Asian people. And finally, I will conclude with how we at Brack University have applied the Afrocentric approach in teaching post-colonial texts. So let me begin. Is the production and dissemination of knowledge conditioned by race, class, gender, or worldviews? Is the knowledge production colorblind? To answer these questions, one can simply refer to the obnoxious views of many European philosophers, sociologists, politicians, and writers on African and Asian people, their cultures, and contributions to mankind. I have no interest in talking about, in Amos Isaiah's words, chattering intellectuals born stinking out of the thigh of Nietzsche, performing their functions in the sordid division of labor for the defense of Western bourgeois society. One can get a better idea of the nakedly hegemonic nature of Western epistemology if one reads Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. So one of the many European epistemological enterprises aimed at subjugating the colonized Asian and African people has been implemented by the English departments across the two continents, Asia and Africa. Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o has brilliantly exposed the very colonial agenda of English studies and demanded the disintegration of English department a long time ago. Well, English departments are now inseparable parts of universities across the world, and English studies still shoulder the white man's burden in spreading European knowledge. English as a discipline in Indian subcontinent came into existence long before it did in the United Kingdom. And its mission was to manufacture bureaucrats in perpetuating the colonial regime through the cultural transformation of the colonized people. Its mission was a part of the British education policy in India proposed by the politician Thomas Babington Macaulay in his Minutes in Indian Education. Macaulay's plan was to form a class of Indians in blood and color, but definitely in English in taste, in opinions, in morals and intellects. Manipulating the education system of the colonized people through systematic inclusion of European authors and texts had been the most effective strategy to strengthen and maintain colonial control. If a change in temperament and attitude, a transformation in the subject's worldview and his sense of agency comes from within the subject himself in favor of his oppressor, nothing more is needed to perpetuate the domination. He and his successors will then willingly conscript themselves as the obliged followers of the dominant oppressors. This is the ultimate power of epistemology. The oppressed will always be put in the receivership of knowledge. Looking at the world through the oppressor's eyes, the oppressed will speak the oppressor's language and unconsciously perpetuate oppression. Western epistemology has successfully enforced European worldviews through most of the liberal arts disciplines till the late 1960s. With the establishment of African American studies as a discipline, not only Black and brown teachers and students in universities, but also people outside the academia for the first time realized the necessity and significance of looking at anything from their own perspective. Black and brown scholars for the first time started questioning the European canon, and Modificati Assante identified the problem not in the European canon, but in African and Asian people's reluctance to come out of that canon. As he states, quote, "There is nothing really wrong about the European canon. It is what it is, the European canon. I think that often African and to a lesser degree Asian scholars are asking Europeans to do what others have not done. We privilege European and Europe as the ones who should set the canon, but just allow us inside in one or two books of our own," end quote. So Assante's Afrocentricity, Theory of Social Change, was the first book that was published in 1980, which introduced the concept of Afrocentricity as a mode of thought and action that demands African people to be at the center of their existence by reclaiming their agency in their own history, language, religion, and culture. The concept of Afrocentricity has been further developed in his later books. In one of his books, he states, quote, "What would African people do if there were no white people? In other words, what natural responses would occur in the relationships, attitude toward the environment, kinship patterns, preferences for colors, type of religion, and historical references for African people if there had not been any intervention of colonialism and enslavement," end quote. So to answer this question, one must look at the world, particularly from African perspective, a perspective that must be specifically located in time and space. He tells that Afrocentricity is about location, precisely because African people have been operating from the fringes of Eurocentric experience. Asante tells that young African students are taught all the European philosophers against all forms of African knowledge and experience, and that this inculcates in them the superiority of Europeans. As has already been mentioned, Afrocentricity is a mood of thought and also of action. And this is why, as an Afrocentrist, Asante founded the first doctoral program in African American Studies at Temple University in 1987. It was the beginning of not only the systematic disciplinary critique of hegemonic Western epistemology, but also of scholarly projects in reclaiming and reconstructing African American history and culture damaged by white epistemic violence. My training in the Department of Africology at Temple University has prepared me to address some of the critical problems that we have been facing in our efforts to rebuilding our identity from the debris of a long colonized past. And Bangladesh, you know, that has been a British colony for more than 200 years. Despite our formal independence in 1947, we are yet to come out of our mental colonization. Till the 1990s, we were hardly aware of the invisible forces of Eurocentric epistemology. The early 90s saw the inclusion of Indian and African writers into the curriculum for the first time. Previously, we used to complete our entire university education without reading anything written by people who either looked like us or shared a common history of exploitation. Yes, the English departments had been really generous to dedicate a 3-credit course to contain the history, culture, literature of the entire ex-colonized world. Yes, it was a privilege for Achebe, Ngugi, Rushdie, Walcott, and a few other selected ex-colonized writers to be taught at a place that was reigned and dominated by Shakespeare's and other British writers or French writers. Can you imagine just, 2 continents and 500-600 years of history is contained within just 3 credits? So English departments throughout the ex-colonies, with the prescriptions from the critics based in the British and American universities, shouldered the responsibility of feeding the innocent students with the so-called psychological traumas and pains that one has to undergo in a post-colonial society. As the bearers of the legacies of colonization, the students caught between the erased pre-colonial past and contaminated post-colonial present are systematically introduced to the baseless identity crisis that the post-colonial authors like Naipaul and Rushdie propagate and the West disseminates. As a result, the post-colonial students ask, what to choose? And this is the question that has haunted numerous people of the present world, crammed with ominous words like hybridity, alterity, and liminality, words that have gotten currency with the advent of post-colonialism and postmodernism. Most post-colonial writers like Walcott and Rushdie portray this doubleness as an essential part of post-colonial identity. Torn between such schizophrenic conflicts, as it is evident in the above quotations from Walcott and Rushdie, the post-colonial writers are always in search of identity. One very typical post-colonial experience has been to discover that what you have been is not the real you, and what you really are have been systematically distorted and or destroyed by the colonial masters. An intelligent and inevitable response to this condition should have been, as Asante asserts above, to locate one cultural nucleus and accordingly define his or her identity by diving into the past. Unfortunately, post-colonial authors and theorists seldom tend to take that route in their way to challenging and changing the European misrepresentation of non-European worlds. And this is where post-colonialism can learn from the Afrocentric school of philosophy, as it has been established by Molefikati Asante through his numerous groundbreaking books and scholarly articles since the 1980s. As a radical intellectual and revolutionary thinker, Asante is well aware of the politics of post-colonialism and postmodernism. And this is why he boldly proclaims that there is no double consciousness. And I do not want to waste our valuable time by quoting post-colonial novelists like Naipaul and poet like Walcott, who spoke so vehemently on African and Asian people. In the remaining part of my talk, I want to focus specifically on how I utilize my training as an Afrocentrist in addressing some of the epistemological crises in post-colonial studies. So post-colonial studies as an academic field owes much to the late Professor Edward Said and his 1978 book, Orientalism. Molefikati Asante's Afrocentric theory as an effective tool in emancipating the disadvantaged and disempowered Oriental subject that Edward Said traces in hegemonic European discourses has been significantly important. Said's formidable scholarship in locating African and Asian people as voiceless objects in their history, written from European perspective, does not necessarily help them rescue and reconstruct their agency. Asante's systematic methodology grounded in African worldview, compared to that of Said's highly criticized one based on postmodern idea of anti-humanism that he borrowed from Michel Foucault, provides a strong platform to the victims of oppression to emerge with a victorious consciousness from their own subjugated positions. The epistemological crisis in postcolonial studies originate from some postcolonial theorists' reappropriation of Saidian ambivalence through sophisticated post-structuralist jargons. An Afrocentric analysis of Said's ideological affiliation and cultural location as he grows from a reactionary scholar in Orientalism to a more complicit critic in culture and imperialism demonstrates that ambivalence as a typical postcolonial issue has its root in Edward Said. Such an ambivalence that is often justified with reference to cultural hybridity has no place in Afrocentric discourse. Afrocentricity believes that hybridization is possible only when one has an authentic, uncontaminated past. Even before the publication of Orientalism in 1978, Molefikati Asante has been speaking of the necessity of an Afrocentric orientation to data, that is, the systematic re-evaluation of production and dissemination of knowledge that concern exploited humanity in general and African people in particular. With the publication of Afrocentricity, the theory of social change in 1980, Asante developed the systematic framework to carry out such re-evaluations, a framework that has been instrumental in challenging and significantly changing the racist pedagogical practices in the United States. My intention is not to compel one to disregard Said's formidable scholarship over his topic, but to explain why Said's effort actually ends up in further deterioration of the wounds he wants to heal. Unlike Said, Asante does not invest his scholarship in exploring the misrepresentation of the Orientalized other in European discourses, as he is already aware that the hypocrisies of European imperialism in its naked form, that the enslavement of his ancestors in the US. Asante targets the victims of imperialism as its readers and sets out to inform them about their strength and about the possibility in rescuing the glorious past that has been damaged by European colonization. Whereas Said locates the Oriental self at the beginning of imperialism, as if the Oriental did not exist prior to the arrival of the colonizers. Asante begins its project with the civilizations in Kemet and Nubia, the two ancient Egyptian cities that were ruled by Black kings and queens. Asante locates the genealogy of scholars like Sheikh Anta Diop, Théophile Obenga, Yusuf Ben Jokanan, Marcus Garvey, Melville Harskobis, and Du Bois. But he goes beyond them in formulating the first theoretical and philosophical platform that reinstates the oppressed as agents in the reconstruction of their history and culture. Asante's approach to history might not be contrapuntal, as it completely negates the European vision of history, but it is exclusively emancipatory in the sense that it prioritizes the position of Africans as subjects or agents in their own history. The emancipatory philosophy of Afrocentricity is manifested in the victorious consciousness that Asante identifies as one of the foremost requirements to be an Afrocentrist, who is well aware of the textual anarchy that she has to encounter the moment he or she reclaims her position in the production of knowledge. In fact, Said's concern related to the politicized nature of critical theories has already been voiced by Professor Wade Nobles, who uses the phrase conceptually incarcerated to describe scholars operating from an alien theoretical framework. Had Said developed a methodology prioritizing the Oriental subjects as agents in critiquing their misrepresentations by Europe, He certainly would have incorporated the rich tradition of resistance to colonization that he understood later. Said's failure to see imperialism from the perspectives of the Orientalized is the direct result of his dependence on Foucauldian notion of resistance as integral part of power. Foucault sees resistance as required condition for power to operate, not as a reaction or a consequence of it. In contrast to Foucault and Said, resistance to Asante is the primary objective of an activist scholar who shoulders the sacred responsibility of speaking for and about the marginalized. As an African American, Asante views resistance as a logical response to repression. A clear historical understanding of one's reality is the fundamental requirement for one to resist against the forces that change the trajectory of his reality in the past and continue to do so. Asante's perspective on resistance differs from that of Foucault because it is relevant to any marginalized group. While Said sees scars of humiliation in the past, Asante finds strengths for transformation. While Said informs his readers about the sheer strength of imperial discourse, Asante fosters the certainty of victory. While Said uses European methodologies he himself criticizes, Asante develops his own methodology grounded on the experience of African agents and subjects in their history. This methodology culminates in the Africological model Asante finally develops in African Pyramids of Knowledge, Kemet, Afrocentricity, and Africology, which was published in 2015. An integral part of this methodology is the location theory that can precisely locate a text in terms of the author's ideological affiliations, political associations, and aesthetic expressions manifested in the very words.
Professor, I'm sorry.
Running out of time?
Yeah, we have only 10 minutes per person.
Okay, let me just 30 seconds.
Thank you very much.
Last paragraphs. So much like Said's intention of rescuing the past of the ex-colonized people from the debris of Eurocentric misrepresentation, post-colonialism is dwarfed when faced with the authorized European history. Post-colonial interpretation of a given text does not lead the reader in reaching a concrete conclusion regarding the author's attitude to Eurocentrism, effects of colonization, and European exploitation of the non-European world. Post-colonialism, with its theories primarily located in the European universities, tends to understand the reality of the ex-colonized world through the knowledge developed in the Western world. In contrast to post-colonial approach to teaching literature, Afrocentricity proposes a methodology that prioritizes the experiences of the African people and tends to look at the phenomena from African perspective. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for taking much time.
Thank you very much, Professor Norman. I appreciate that very much. So I'm just reminding the rest of the panelists that we, for the time, we really should try to stick to about 10 minutes. Our next presenter is Dr. Amma Mazama, who is finally on. She is professor and graduate director in the Department of Africology at Temple University. Her long-standing research interests include Afrocentric theory and praxis, especially in the areas of spirituality and education. She has published widely. Most notable is her edited book, The Afrocentric Paradigm. Dr. Mazama is a leading theorist of Afrocentricity and editor or author of more than 20 books and more than 100 articles. She is managing editor of the Journal of Black Studies. She is the Parat of Afrocentricity International and Mambo of Voodoo. Dr. Mazama.
Hotep, thank you very much. And I really apologize for being not ready. My internet connection is unstable, so I'm going to turn off my camera, if you don't mind, to make sure I do not get ejected in the middle of the process. I wanted to first thank Dr. Asante for putting this event together. I think it's very important that we take the time to really reflect on where we are. After all, Afrocentricity came into being as a theory 40 years ago. And I think it's really important, again, to look back and ask ourselves, where have we been? How much ground have we covered? And how much more do we need to do? So I wanted to talk for no more than 10 minutes, because this is the time that we've been given on Afrocentricity as a new paradigm. I mean, not so new anymore, but 40 years for a paradigm is really not that long. And we see it because we see that we are still having debates about the proper name for the discipline. We have debates about the disciplinary language. That's an article I've been working on for a while now, in terms of the emergence of terms like African-centered, African-centeredness. And I've been trying to really understand those terms because they're usually quite ill-defined, and in fact defined in ways that are contradictory. But this is not what I want to talk about. I just want to look back and remind us that, again, Afrocentricity
Dr. Mazama, did we lose you? Hello? It seems like we may have lost the connection.
emerged at the very heart of the Afrocentricity. Excuse me, you've lost me?
I think we got you now. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about these, internet problems. But I was saying that the heart of the Afrocentric idea lies the assertion that African people must operate as self-conscious cultural agents, no longer satisfied to be defined and manipulated from without, but more in control of our destinies through a positive and assertive self-definition, through our occupying our human space as African people. And we also understand as Afrocentrists that the criteria for this self-definition and this assertion of ourselves must, of course, be drawn from African culture. And this is why the African worldview is so important to us. In order to fully appreciate the significance of Afrocentricity, it is necessary, in my opinion, to examine the circumstances that made Afrocentricity necessary to begin with. And of course, that means that we have to talk about white supremacy, because Afrocentricity came about in response to white supremacy. White supremacy has taken several forms, which are clearly not exclusive. In its most obvious form, white supremacy has expressed itself as a physical process of pure, often extremely brutal violence, physical violence, killing us, murdering us, raping us. The European enslavement of millions of Africans. I'm having some problems here. The European enslavement of millions of Africans during several
So, yeah, we just, it is true that when we use the technology that, like this, sometimes we remain vulnerable. We're going to have to do an Afrocentric Zoom. Dr. Mazama, are you still there? Okay, I think that we should probably go to our next speaker. I think she's had these difficulties since she's been away. Dr. Mazama, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, all right. So we're going to go to our next presenter. And I think that way we'll be able to catch Dr. Mazama later. All right, let me just start with, well, let's go to our next presenter, who is Dr. Nadia Kokoma. She is a historian and an Africanist. She holds a PhD degree in world history from the Institute of African Studies. at the Russian Academy of Sciences. And her PhD dissertation was devoted to the history of the Afrocentric movement in the United States. She currently works as a senior research fellow at the Center of History and Cultural Anthropology of the Institute of African Studies in Moscow. Her major areas of specialization are intellectual history, history of the African diaspora, cultural identity, historical memory, cross-cultural communication. Dr. Dr. Kokolkova has a particular research interest in exploring the genesis and evolution of social, political, and intellectual movements such as Afrocentricity, Pan-Africanism, and Afropolitanism. She also has the experience of field work in Tanzania and other parts of Africa. Dr. Kolkova her publications are over 50 in total, including the first book on Afrocentricity in Russian, which is Afrocentrism in the USA, Theory and Practice of Sociocultural Transformation, which was published in Moscow in 2019. In fact, her major professor wrote the first article in the year 2000 in Russian in African American study and on Afrocentricity, and I think that was Professor Gavaristova. So Dr. Kolkova has written also a monograph in the Russian language, which has a summary in English, which is called Afrocentricity, the Evolution of the Theory in the Context of American History. So we are very happy and pleased to have this outstanding intellectual with us. Nadia.
Hello, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Asante for this beautiful introduction and for having me here today. It's my great pleasure to be a part of this event. I would like to share some of my thoughts on Afrocentric epistemology. In my short presentation, I will try to concentrate on transformative power of language and key functions of Afrocentric epistemology. Over the centuries, Africa was considered as a wild, backward periphery, and Africans as barbarians excluded from knowledge production and dissemination, from culture and history. The colonial epistemology and colonial language were spread by outsiders, foreigners, writers, adventurers, missionaries, colonial officers. They were interested in creating an image of Africa, changed over time, but always remained a cliché transformed in stereotypes. Many stereotypes are still alive. We face them every day. In his sarcastic essay, How to Write About Africa, published in 2005, Kenyan author and journalist Binyavanga Wainaina, who unfortunately passed away last year, gave instruction. Always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in your title. Subtitles may include the words Zanzibar, Maasai, Zulu, Zambezi, Congo, Nile, big, sky, shadow, drum, sun, or bygone. Also useful are words such as timeless, primordial, and tribal. Language shapes the way we think. Rhetoric has an impact on the system of knowledge and the way of understanding and perception. The problem of the geopolitics of knowledge connected with different aspects of the making of human sciences in the field of African studies remains relevant for most research and educational institutions all over the globe. Epistemological decolonization, started in the mid-20th century, is still ongoing. At the end of the 20th century, Africa went beyond the framework of Eurocentric ideas, declaring itself, sorry, at the end of the 20th century, Africa went beyond the framework of Eurocentric ideas, declaring itself not only a continent with a rich and diverse culture and considerable potential, but also capable of shaping a worldview and uniting people all over the world. And Afrocentric movement had made a significant contribution to these processes. Afrocentric epistemology is rooted in ancient African intellectual experience. It dates back to the works of the educator Edward Wilman Blyden, the American sociologist and civil rights activist William Du Bois, Senegalese historian and philosopher Cheikh Anta Diop, the first president of Ghana and the creator of conscientism philosophy Kwame Nkrumah, the philosopher and psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon, and etc. The genetic substrata of Afrocentric epistemology is rather complex. The Afrocentric theory propounded by Professor Asante in the late of 1970s and the beginning of 1980s was intended to create new pattern of thinking, to promote intellectual pluralism and cultural diversity, to provide new narratives in which Africans presented as full-fledged actors of history and culture. The definitions of Afrocentricity can be multiple, as its dimensions, but most of them lie within the scope of epistemology. Afrocentric epistemology has many functions, but today I would like to emphasize three of them. Like any other epistemologies, the Afrocentric one has the function of cultural legitimization. This function is closely linked to critical function. Afrocentric scholars criticize the universalism of Eurocentric epistemology and try to provide legitimacy for African culture, mostly through education.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me, Lehasa. Can we ask you to mute your audio? Please mute your audio. Thank you. I'm sorry, Nadia.
It's okay. Thank you. The second function is indicated in the suggestion of another perspective. It is reflected in the intention to make worldview. Sorry, my my voice was okay. The second function is indicated in the suggestion of another perspective. It's reflected in the intention to make worldview and linguistic shift. According to the words of Professor Asante, Afrocentric scholars reinvented the discourse around African people. They have become agents in their own history. The relevant contribution of Afrocentric epistemology is that it has changed the language of social sciences. Today, many scholars try to avoid using such terms as slaves or tribe. Also, the term African Americans was formalized due to the efforts of Afrocentric scholars and activists. And finally, the third function is providing a continuation of an intellectual tradition. In this context, it's important to remember about the connection between, for instance, Afrocentricity, Afrocentric epistemology, and Pan-African intellectual tradition. The last decades of the 20th century were marked by the beginning of the shift from the Western perspective toward multicultural perspectives. Updating the terminological series through the introduction of categories such as Africology, African Renaissance, African Humanism, and many, many others, has designed to show new vectors of research and academic discussions. Afrocentric epistemology has influenced on educational program and institution. Today, it's possible to notice that South African or Tanzanian authors of student books make reference to Afrocentric approach. At the present time, Afrocentric epistemology are widely discussed not only in the United States and African countries, but also in Europe, Asia, in Russia. Yes, it should be noted that the first Russian article about Afrocentric theory was written in 1992 by my teacher, my scientific advisor, Tatiana Gavristova, who is unfortunately absent today. And I would like to conclude with these words. Nowadays, social scholars, even Eurocentric ones, can discuss and criticize Afrocentric epistemology, but can hardly ignore it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadia. And now we will go to our next presenter. Dr. Carolyn Calloway Thomas is a past president of the World Communication Association and professor and chair of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. She is author of many books, including Empathy in the Global World, An Intercultural Perspective, Intercultural Communication, a Text with Readings, and Intercultural Communication Roots and Routes, and she has co-edited other books as well. She has a forthcoming book, Intercultural Communication Between Chinese and North Americans. She is the winner of many awards, including the 2020 National Communication Association's Samuel Becker Distinguished Service Award, the National Council of Black Studies Paul Robeson and Zora Neale Hurston Award, a Ford Postdoctoral Fellowship, a Carnegie Scholarship, and Grambling State University's Distinguished Alumni Award. She is also inducted into the Central States Communication Hall of Fame. At this time, Dr. Carolyn Calloway Thomas.
Thank you, Dr. Asante, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm delighted to be here. Every now and then, but not as often as we would like, a big idea appears on the world scene that alters what we think, how, and with what effect. Such big ideas strike at the heart of policies, principles, schemes, and plans that underlie philosophies about the nature of society and how it should work for the common good, the good we share in common. Afrocentricity is one such big idea. In his major seminal work, The Afrocentric Idea, Asante writes, Afrocentricity is not merely an artistic or literary movement. Not only is it an individual or collective quest for authenticity, it is above all the total use of method to effect psychological, political, social, cultural, and economic change. Today at this August gathering, I invite us to take Afrocentricity further and connect it more directly to some rhetorical and practical domains that are undermining epistemic ways of knowing and being for Black Americans. Linkages that ring like fire bells in the night in terms of their ability to drive the agendas for Black Americans. A study of the master trope repetition is the spot towards which my intellectual road leads. In a larger piece, I claim repetition has become an existential usurper, just as Eurocentricity usurped our minds 40 years ago. But first, a definition. By existential usurpation, I mean the sheer persuasive power of repetition to divert one's attention from other crucial issues of a group's agenda through magnification and monopolization. Usurpation causes us to lose focus and away from other galvanizing forces and issues that need claim our attention, with a potential and real cost to the group that may be greater than what members could even imagine. The master trope repetition is a species of existential usurpation, and we need to study it valiantly as we search for more meaningful and effective ways of solving the problems and challenges that confront African Americans. Repetition is a unifying trope and can prevent the division of the attention of a people. It is seductive. For example, to utter President Trump's name for many Blacks and whites is to associate it with the words racism and racist. To call to the foreground an association between the social environments in which Black Americans move and have their being, from police brutality to slights to microaggressions, to his reference to African countries as a-holes, etc., etc. The repetitive trope racism is so muscular and has the potential to derail our individual and collective human projects using the moth effect. Just as a moth is drawn to a flame, so too, I argue, does repetition draw our attention to racism while largely ignoring much of the capacious terrain around us: the trees, the bushes, the flowers, rivers and streams, bees, squirrels, and chipmunks. We have known since 5th century BC that tropes play a central role not only in speech, but also in cognition, conceptualization, and comprehension. As one writer argues, it is frequent repetition that produces a natural tendency, and that the more frequently two things are experienced together, the more likely it will be that the experience or recall of one will stimulate the recall of the other. To illustrate what I mean, dare I ask you to think about one topic that is rarely mentioned because of the tyrannical hold of the master trope racism, and it is abortion. Yes, abortion. Existential usurpation in the form of repetition keeps the topic away from the public square. Catherine Davies of the Restoration Project argues stunningly that the 20 million Black abortions since Roe v. Wade in 1973 are more than the entire African American population in 1960. 36% of all abortions in the United States in 2014 were performed on Black women. And Planned Parenthood facilities are located mainly in Black and brown communities. Jason Riley notes in a 2019 article in the Wall Street Journal, and I quote him, "In New York City, more Black pregnancies end in abortion than in live births." I am not suggesting here or recommending or advocating that there is a conspiracy on the part of Planned Parenthood to eliminate Black babies, nor am I arguing for or against abortion necessarily. Rather, I am simply noting as plaintively as I can what happens when the moth-like repetitive master trope racism usurps our minds and takes us away from other issues that need to claim our attention like a fire bell in the night. The repetitive trope racism is also a lumper, since it exploits working class as a category for white people only. This means that the trope racism also prevents us from focusing on meaningful class differentiation among Black Americans and their treatment in society. The repetitive refrain, systemic racism, puts Oprah and the Obamas in the same category as the men who daily sit under tall, stately pine trees in my birthplace, Bernice, Louisiana, as they wait diligently for jobs to come their way, but they do not come. Today, I urge us to consider the intersectional, ideological, and rhetorical work that urgently needs tending using an Afrocentric lens. I invite us to examine more robustly the rhetorical mechanisms that underlie social dynamics and how our understanding and practice of Afrocentricity can help heal and solve some of our messy and urgent human problems. There is a fierce urgency in such areas as low reading scores for Black children and strategic zoning laws that prevent Black children from attending the best schools so that they can pursue excellence and make their dreams come true. Richard Reeves and Dream Hoarders, How the American Middle Class is Leaving Everyone in the Dust, and why that is a problem and what to do about it, argues that high-income parents are now passing on their class status to their children, threatening American ideals of equal opportunity of social mobility. This is being done while the term systemic racism, in a moth-like way, keeps our eyes focused too much on race and perhaps not enough on class. Cleverly, could it be that the existential usurper, racism, keeps our attention away from what and how middle-class whites, the dream hoarders, hoard dreams from the rest of us, as Reeves suggests? So where do we go from here? I imagine a future for Afrocentricity that adds another layer of complexity to our epistemic world. We need a more balanced and nuanced discourse paradigm, which can fill the explanatory vacuum that is being diminished by existential usurpation. If not now, then when? Even during our darkest days, during slavery, our ancestors who were rebuked and scorned could sing the sorrow songs and fill their hearts and minds with the joy of knowing and expecting that at last they would flourish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carolyn Calloway. We now will go to our next presenter, Dr. Simpiwe Sisanti, who is a professor at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. He's on the Faculty of Education, and he's the editor of the important International Journal of African Renaissance Studies. His PhD was obtained at Stellenbosch University, where he taught for 7 years in the Department of Journalism. He's also taught in the Department of Journalism, Media, and Philosophy at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. And prior to joining the Western Cape, University of Western Cape. He worked for the University of South Africa, the Institute for African Renaissance Studies. He's published in accredited journals on a variety of issues, including education, gender, African philosophy, journalism, politics, and spirituality. He is the author of 2 books, a co-editor of 1 book, and a contributor of chapters in a number of books. Dr. Simpiwe Sesante.
Thank you very much, Professor Asante. Afrocentric greetings to all my sisters and brothers who are gathered here. I wish to express my appreciation for the thoughtful gesture from Professor Asante to invite me to this very important gathering. And so as we begin to reflect, I'd like us to recall that in this year, the year 2020, we are marking the 40th anniversary of the passing over of one of the best sons of the soil, Walter Rodney. And when those who were paying tribute to him were reflecting on his life, Victor Harding and others said, but there's a world awaiting us. Indeed, there are many worlds awaiting us. One is the world of our children not yet born, and those who are young waiting to be their best possible selves. But this cannot happen unless the center is transformed. But the center itself cannot be transformed unless we ourselves are transformed. And so that is then the major and clarion call of Afrocentricity, that in order for us to transform the world, we ourselves have got to be transformed. And I'm very happy that I've just spoken after Dr. Calloway Thomas, because she made an important point, asking us and interrogating about what we as Afrocentrists are going to practically offer to the world in order to change it for a better world. And before I proceed, I'd like to recall here that at a point in time, there was a conversation in a meeting between one of the best sons, between 2 of the best sons of the African soil, Professor Molefi Asante and Sheikh Anta Diop. And Asante then said to Diop that his quest was to defend the African continent. And very lovingly, Diop said to Asante, but your task is not so much to defend Africa. Africa does not need to be defended. The major task is to advance the African continent. So at this point in time, we need to understand that ours is not so much about defending the African continent. Ours is about advancing the philosophy, the thrust that our ancestors left for us. And so at this point in time, Sheikh Anta Diop taught us that it was important to study the history of Kemet, not for sentimental purposes, but in order for us to be able to offer solutions at this point in time, the thoughts that were prevalent so many centuries ago. And as I reflect upon this, Dr. Calloway, we understand that our ancestors taught the world what should be obvious to everyone. And the fact is that the beginning, the home, the first home of all human beings is the womb of the mother. And that is the beginning of humanity. And that when we are laid to rest, our bodies again are returned to the womb, which is the earth. And so our beginning is with the womb, and our final destination is again with the womb. This is a very significant lesson that was given to us by our ancestors at a time when, you know, the Eurocentric world, through its philosophies, subjugated women in the world, and that kind of a thinking was imposed upon the African world, because prior that, the African people revered women, they revered motherhood, Before that, we were taught, in fact, that, as Sheikh Anta Diop tells us, that evil was introduced into the world by males when Seth murdered his brother. But interestingly, at that point in time, the being that brought together, that remembered a dismembered body of Osiris was none other than a woman. And so our ancestors, metaphorically and philosophically, pointed us to the way that women have always historically been the ones where, men have messed up. They've always reorganized and brought together the world. And so in this point, the metaphor of the narrative of creation of our ancestors was that women are not here to be rescued by men, sympathetic men from a misogynistic world, from a sexist world, that women themselves are going to be the leaders in that revolution of restoring humanity to the world. And so the question then of Afrocentricity is bringing and calling our attention to the philosophies that are going to recreate humanity. And so when Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Mangaliso Sobukwe, and all other revolutionaries uttered and articulated the view that, we are fighting for the noblest cause on earth, the liberation of humankind, we then understand that our ancestors already gave us a way forward through the philosophies of Africa. And so our ancestors taught us again that, we've got to understand that, the manner in which we understand family, we understand it as those who have come before us, those that are alive, and those that are yet to come. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o has found a beautiful way of metaphorizing this and saying that our ancestors are our inspiration, and that we who are living are performing a task of perspiration, and that those who are yet to come are our aspiration. And so the teaching of our ancestors is inculcating in our minds that we must not live selfish lives. We must not be about ourselves and ourselves alone, that at all times we must always think about the future, and that we must prepare the future of those that are yet to come. And so these then are the teachings of Afrocentricity that we've got an obligation as academics, as thinkers, as activists, to give a clear sense of direction about what we want to do in a practical way, combining theory, combining philosophy with practice. And so what has then happened is that there's a great progress that is taking place. 5 years ago, the young people in this country, in the form of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, demanded not just an decolonized education in South Africa, but they moved further than that. They asked for and demanded, in fact, an Afrocentric education, because these young people 5 years ago in Tanzania understood that the Afrocentric thrust is not merely about opposing. The Afrocentric orientation is about proposing. So we do not only oppose, but we also propose. And therefore, it is important for us that we have to clearly be able to articulate a vision, and do so in a manner that is clear, because what has happened in the past, and this is what has frustrated the liberation movement, whether we be here on the home continent in Africa or we be abroad, that we have been very vague about what we have not outlined the specifics. We have offered slogans as opposed to offering clarity. And Sheikh Anta Diop told us that it doesn't matter, how much verbose we can be about issues. Verbosity will never be able to replace clarity. And so I see that I'm left with 1 minute and I'm not going to ask for an extension. But as I step down, allow me, program director, to do what I haven't done, and appeal and appease my ancestors whom I did not ask for permission before I spoke. Izizwe zamachonyana udikizo sawunkomo mthuzimele, amakhomo azoqhina boqoqostonga starotuka namahlathi, amachawochiwo khawuto phalotoko poto banobulawo ngonyamana, amantakwento tyebele entlomento libelo khwangashi, amanqosi nociko shuthi tibono zengabantu bomlambo. And as I'm saying all this, I'm hoping that my sisters and brothers in the presence are helping me to pour libation to our ancestors. Hotep, asante sana. Asante sana.
I'm sorry, I guess you couldn't hear me. I was thanking Professor Cisanti, but I was also introducing Dr. Patricia Reed Merritt, who is author, educator, scholar, community activist, and performing artist. She is the Distinguished Professor of Africana Studies and Social Work at Stockton University in New Jersey. She served as coordinator of the Africana Studies program, spearheaded the university's annual Fannie Lou Hamer Human and Civil Rights Symposium, and chaired the National Fannie Lou Hamer Statue Committee. Dr. Reed Merritt is also the founder and artistic director of Afro One Dance, Drama and Drum Theater. She is the author of numerous publications, including the national Blackboard bestseller, Sister Power, How Phenomenal Black Women Are Rising to the Top, Righteous Self-Determination, the Black Social Work Movement in America, Race in America, How a Pseudo-Scientific Concept Shaped Human Interaction, and then Tarnished Legacy, a Reluctant Memoir, and then A State of the History of Race and Racism in the United States, and Race and Identity in Hispanic America, the white, the black, and the brown. At this time, Dr. Pat Reed Merritt.
Hotep, Dr. Santi, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this discussion. And I thank all the other previous panelists who certainly were inspiring in their presentation to help us get some orientation on the kinds of things that we might want to talk about today. There have been many positive things that have been said. One of the things that was just commented on, in fact, by Dr. Calloway Thomas, is that what Molefi Asante brought to us was a big idea. She is 100% correct. It is a big idea. And it's a big idea that has had an impact, not just on the academy, but on the community in general, not just the national community, but certainly on our global community. One of the things that I've been interested in is that as an Afrocentric scholar, we've always been taught knowledge is not simply for knowledge's sake. Knowledge is something that you need in order to uplift the people. And so since the introduction of Afrocentric theory and Afrocentric thought, more than 40 years ago by Dr. Santi, you have had scholars, students, academicians, administrators, and just public intellectuals questioning the usefulness of this particular concept. And it's been important, it's been critiqued from a variety of different sources for sure, but certainly has also been criticized as well. And so my question, a question that I started asking almost a decade and a half ago, is what's the impact of this new knowledge on the people? More specifically, I wanted to examine the popularization of Afrocentricity among the people. Because again, what's the purpose of having knowledge if the knowledge is not shared, if the knowledge is not spread, again, among the people? And so in my brief 10 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about a research paper I did, and one was published in the book on Dr. Santi, that raised that question. Well, what's the word on the street? That was my question. What's the word on the street? In order to discover what the word is on the street, I thought it was important to talk to people on the street. And so one of the things that I understood before undertaking this particular project is that, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of Afrocentric thought or being Afrocentric is not simply an academic concept. As what was indicated in the literature before, this is one of the rare times in which an academic concept sort of leaped into the national conversation. And it's not just the national conversation anymore. Of course, it's leaped into the global conversation as well, as part of the public lexicon, where people discuss, I know something about, or I think I know something about Afrocentricity or what it means. And so what I did about a decade and a half ago is I decided to conduct some research to ask people, just what did you know about this? You know, not people who were inside the academy, but people who were, from my point of view, sort of ordinary folks. And so I traveled to 3 different cities. I traveled to New York, I traveled to Baltimore, and to Philadelphia. And I specifically attended festivals, Afrocentric kinds of festivals, or what they call Black Heritage festivals. And at these festivals, I went around and started interviewing people. And I wanted to know, you know, some basic answers to some very basic questions, you know. What is this thing that you're calling Afrocentric? Have you ever heard of this person called Malefi Asante? In what ways do you think you're living an Afrocentric life? I want to ask questions like that. And I can say, without hesitation, I talked with probably 80 to 90 people, certainly more than 35 or 40 at each site I was at. And someone questioned me, well, why did you go to Black festivals? Well, because I thought those people would be a little more conscious than perhaps any other large gathering that I could find. And of course, the truth of the matter is that they were. When I interviewed them about their knowledge of Afrocentricity or their view of Afrocentricity or their understanding of the concept, they were surprisingly more knowledgeable than I anticipated. And we're not talking about people who went to Temple or who went to the Stocktons and who studied per se, but we are talking about people who had been influenced by others who studied. They had been influenced by what they saw on TV. They had been influenced perhaps by what they read in some book and decided they wanted to do further investigation. And so the answer to my question was yes. This concept of Afrocentricity, Afrocentric thought, it has become popularized among the people. Another way of demonstrating this, and I did this years ago, I went and did a Google search. And I wanted to know, you know, what was Google saying about this thing that we were all talking about, you know, Afrocentricity. And I actually did that this morning again before I came on to make this brief presentation. And so even if you put the word Afrocentric into Google search, you will come up with 5,820,000 possibilities. And so clearly you have to say, well, what exactly am I looking for? You had that many references to the word Afrocentric. And then I said, let me narrow this a bit. And I put an Afrocentric approach. And the word approach was important to me because, you know, in my background, training and social work, you know, I'm a practitioner. I want to know how things are going to be used. What's practical here? What can we take and utilize in our professional work, again, to uplift the people? And so I put the word Afrocentric approach in, and that came back with more than 382,000 references. And again, the question was exactly what you're looking for. I put the word Afrocentric practice in, came up with another 380,000. And then I put the word in, well, let's narrow it down, Afrocentricity specifically. And it came up with about 186,000 references. And then I stepped back and said, well, let me put in Afrocentric education. What's this thing about Afrocentric education? And there was 113,300,000 references to the word Afrocentric education. And so if there was ever any doubt, the extent to which Afrocentricity, the notion of being Afrocentric, which the people described at these various festivals they were attended. You know, I would ask the question, why are you here? And they would say, this gives me the opportunity to be my Afrocentric self all day. This gives me the opportunity to expose my children to people who think similar to what I'm thinking. This gives me the opportunity to declare myself as an Afrocentric man or an Afrocentric woman. And that is key. Because initially, when we talked about what was Afrocentricity all about, It was the ability for us to find and claim our own center. And this language that is part of the public discourse now speaks specifically to what people are trying to do when they begin to embrace themselves as Afrocentric individual. And sometimes we look at that and we say, well, they do it in minimalistic kinds of ways. That may be true, but it is the first step. And so we see people who decide to dress themselves in African ways, to adorn themselves in African ways, to rename themselves in African ways. It is very, very important that the people have the ability to do that. And in doing that, one of the things that they're able to do, again, is to be able to investigate or claim agency, as we say, the extent to which people are willing and able to embrace themselves as an African descended individual. And so after talking to these people, after analyzing the literature and after asking myself, what does this all mean? I came to the conclusion, the only one that I could, from one that was actually driven by database in the sense is that I was able to collect information from people. I was able to ask them about their background. I was able to quiz them further about the initial answers that they gave. And what I have concluded is that the concept of Afrocentricity has left the building. And when I say has left the building, I mean the academy. It is not something simply that we're sitting around discussing in the academy, but what we have taught to students have allowed those students to share their knowledge with others. And it's allowed people to begin to embrace this notion is that there's something about this concept that uplifts me as an individual, that helps me feel as though I can be part of a movement that is about more than anything else. It is in fact about self-determination, that we have the right to self-determination, and that's what people are expressing. And so one of the most important developments in Afrocentric theory, Afrocentric thought, and Afrocentric practice for me is that it's been popularized among the people. And the people have embraced it as a useful concept to identify with who they are and who they want to be. Thank you.
Professor Asante, you are muted.
Thank you very much for that. I want to thank Dr. Patricia Merritt for her presentation. And I want to also say that the next presenter is Lihasa Malloy, who is a lecturer in the Department of Development Studies at the University of South Africa, holds a master's degree in the field of development studies. He is a doctoral student addressing the topic towards an Afrocentric development paradigm in Africa, supervised by Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Gatsheni, and also with the assistance of other professor. He is a passionate scholar on decolonization debates, most particularly pursuing scholarship in Afrocentricity as an African-centered decolonial paradigm. We are very happy to have him to present here. And his work has already made its way to the States. At this time, Lihasa Malloy. Is Lihasa with us?
Thank you very much, Professor Asante.
All right.
And greetings to, yes, I'm here, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Greetings to everybody. I hope that I'm audible. And thank you very much. I'm grateful indeed to Professor Asante and the Department of Africology for this heartwarming to share my few personal work I value with every fiber of my being. Your work has not only reshaped my career outlook, but has revolutionized my life to interpret reality differently than I did before. Through Afrocentric historicism, we have come to learn that as African people, we were made to fight on the side of our self-imposed colonial masters and to be against ourselves. We became participants in what Professor Asante calls Western triumphalism. which has nothing to do with our destiny as people who had become conquered. Perhaps it is suffice to say the critical question in Afrocentric scholarship is, have we as African people found our jet, our stasis, our standpoint, our locus of initiation? How do we recenter our lives from dissentersness? How do we reground and regroup ourselves from the embarrassing atrocities of the past? Just as Professor Mazama emphasized in the Afrocentric paradigm, that we have uncritically fed on Western modernity's ideologies that have nothing to do with us, such as democracy, development, progress, which are actually rooted within the European cultural ethos to advance the order, which is responsible for linguicides, epistemicides, genocides. How do we reorder ourselves from this plague? And of course, indeed, in my own reflection, which I have framed Afrocentricity and the significance of advancing African agency for African resurgence. Indeed, Afrocentricity as a revolutionary intellectual paradigm has given many students of African descent the hope they need to stand on their own legs and to trust their own knowledge and voice in a world that has sought to diminish their natural flair towards excellence by pinpointing the dilemma created by colonial scholarship to reproduce African people as imbeciles who have contributed nothing but despotic civilization in comparison to the so-called great nations of Europe. This portrayal of Africans in the negative through European historians was nothing other than an attempt to dehumanize Africans, thus removing them from the zone of humanity and the zone of subhuman savages who must rely on the tutelage of Europeans. Just as G.W.F. Hegel made his selfish pronouncements regarding Africa and Africans as a place of barbarity occupied by subhumans without any history and culture or concept of the deity. It was on the basis of this evil project, drinking from the same supremacist well as Hegel, advanced the idea that the only hope for such backward people is to inject them with modern Euro-American defined value systems as a way to redeem them from their primitivity and bring them into the divine light of the image of the European men and women. It is within this context that Afrocentricity, as a liberative, perspectivist discourse, provides the speculative hope grounded in the riches of African everlasting river of greatness, greatly influenced by the body of work as postulated by Ethiopian historicism, Kawaiian communitarian philosophy as advanced by Professor Kairenga, and the negritude agenda. Thus, Afrocentricity has emerged to dismantle European false pronounced universalist dicta with an aim to centralize African voices within their own history and culture, and with Africans as their own. We need to collectively reflect, do we have what it takes to re-emerge? I wish to state categorically that there should be nothing for us without us. As already stated by Professor Asante, who must speak for us if we don't speak for ourselves? Therefore, we are the oracles for the advancement of our own truths. Who will speak for the African dead if we fail to become that voice? Professor Asante is asking that question. Born and bred within the family of the Baptist evangelicals, and having been the lay preacher myself, I used to be provoked by a particular text in the Old Testament, by the book of Isaiah chapter 6, in which the prophet who was seeking to liberate others reached a moment of his own awakening and self-confrontation, the awakening of his own sinfulness, while he attempted to save others. His repentance and cleansing, and his second call into the ministry after his cleansing. The call was clearly expressed as follows: who will go for us? Who will go on our behalf to speak to the nations? Because he had been liberated, he responded, send me. In a similar way, the Afrocentric call is about self-examination, self-confrontation, which also provides an avenue for collective action to spark change in how we look at the world, how we epistemically engage, and with whose knowledge. Having been a member of the Department of Development Studies for a period of more than 20 years, I had to confront myself that yes, indeed, I had been an agent of epistemic colonial expedition in which I taught without deep conviction what I was teaching. I was historically ungrounded and uncritically disseminated what I then considered to be knowledge, but which I later became more aware that it was an anti-Africa. Though of an African descent, my mind was captured in a sense that I was speaking from a foreign ground into Africa. I did not factor Africa and African scholars. Every single reference was informed by European scholars. I remember vividly, it was in 2016, speaking for the first time in a conference organized by the School of Social Sciences at UNISA. Members of my department who attended the presentation exclaimed that Moloi spoke for the first time after years of silence. I addressed the college on the theme towards an Afrocentric paradigm in Africa, and indeed this theme later became the mark. Later that year, I went to defend my argument. Just this year, I've just been able to give about 6 international keynote addresses on Afrocentricity and the need to dismantle the European cognitive empire. And I've also been able to write up about 2 published book chapters already, addressing the significance of Afrocentricity and rethinking development discourse in Africa. As I close, I firmly believe that African agency must be reawakened from the mummified state, that we should take charge to tell ahead of my future task. Beyond my doctoral students, both masters and doctoral, host seminars reflecting on Afrocentric ideologies as necessary of South Africa has begun the path of renewal in its quest towards becoming a African university in the service of humanity. I'm glad that I've seen the dean of my college here, Professor Masemola, and I'm glad that the College of Human Sciences has drafted the Transformation Charter, which speaks to the need for decolonizing our very discourses in order to enable African corridors at UNISA have begun to experience reverberations of hope as young scholars began to question the validity of European canon of knowledge. Indeed, there is a rainbow of hope which will usher newness in their lives. Thank you, Professor Asante, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lehasa Malloy, for that presentation. And now we go to the dean, the executive dean, Gamatso Masamalo. Masamalo is the executive dean of human sciences at the University of South Africa. He's the author of the book, South African Autobiography After Deleuze, and he is currently serving in the College of Human Sciences. In his position, he instituted the Masters and Doctoral Award, the most prestigious and meritorious of which is aptly named, thank you, I should say, after Professor Molefi Kete Asante. I really want to personally thank the Dean for naming those awards after me. In recognition of the depth of Professor Asante's influence and coherence in affecting epistemic change through Afrocentricity. Professor Masemola has a history of being the co-editor with the Liberty Hove of Strategies of Representation and Autobiography. He also has contributed book chapters such as the Autobiography in Africa, in the Oxford History of the Novel in English, the novel in Africa and the Atlantic world. He is a full professor of English in UNISA, and he has published in top drawer journals and articles that have been received both locally and internationally. And he holds the distinction of being internationally recognized through his international keynote addresses with the invitation of Professor Stephen Ross of York University. We are delighted and honored to have the Dean to speak to us now. Dean Masamala.
Thank you, Professor Asante, for giving me this opportunity. And I'm really grateful for the speakers that precede me that really showed what kind of gathering that we are in. I think on a level that shows that our commitment to the intellectual project, not merely as being black bodies out there who can only be appended to a hashtag whenever we discuss theoretically Black Lives Matter. My point of departure is that this is call of autobiography. I affirm, first and foremost, the Black experience in its totality. And I want to pay special mind tonight towards the work that Professor Asante has done, besides a lot of the esoteric discourses that we've had and engaged that are quite liberating in many ways. But I want to go to Professor Asante's autobiography, it's the School of Autobiography, Run Towards Africa. It's a very important text that relocates the thinking and the centrality of Euro-American thought and places squarely in the experience of the encounter with Africa. Very unapologetic and also quite a revelation as to the historical parallels that take place between the Montgomery bus boycotts, for example, and the Alexander bus boycotts. The incursion into Africa is also intellectual, not just physical. It is also spiritual in many ways, and we do appreciate that. That is why, as I start this text, this talk, I would like to quote contemporary thinker Ta-Nehisi Coates, who says, "And I still urge you to struggle for the memory of your ancestors, struggle for wisdom." And this from his 2015 book, Between the World and Me. I want to go there deliberately because in positing the idea of Afrocentricity, we have to straddle almost like trapeze artists, a world where we affirm our ontological density as human beings. And yet at the same time, we have to try and eschew the temptation to form an essentialist position that is immovable, that is stagnant. And so I go back to this and say that consistent with the policy, the principle of Sankofa, that we have to look back at memory in order to make headway. And so I want to say that in reading As I Run Towards Africa, I found full and bold expression of the ideas that he had earlier on expressed in his Kemet, Afrocentricity and knowledge, where Professor Asante elucidates the Afrocentrist idea and enterprise as seeking to uncover and use codes, paradigms, symbols, motifs, myths, and circles of discussions that reinforce the centrality of African ideals and values as a valid frame of reference for acquiring and examining data. I want particularly to say that it's very important that we know that it's not just the codes that are external codes of the Euro-American North or the North and South binary, but codes that are peculiarly relating to Africa, speaking to the being in Africa, paradigms that liberate us by questioning, by interrogating the premises of the bedrock on which Western knowledge is founded. Symbols that mean a whole lot more than Hollywood and Wakanda, but symbols that speak to our depth, that speak to our place in the universe, and motifs, myths, and circles of discussion that reinforce the centrality of African ideas in the various valid frame of reference. And I think that is what is important. What I try to do in my scholarship latterly under the influence of Afrocentricity is to further problematize the idea of memory as one of the key crises in the African world. But it's important also, to quote Asante, to sit and recognize that there is the profoundly disturbing decentering of African people from a subject position within their own narrative. So this is very disturbing. That's why it's important that when you look at the text as I run towards Africa, you glean a sense of a re-centering of African people, because we cannot just be problems or just objects, or to quote from the words of the scholar Louis R. Gordon in his essay, The Problem of Biography, the Study of the Thought of Black Intellectuals, where he says, in the souls of Black folk, W.E.B. Du Bois observed a tendency that led to his making an important distinction, that Blacks are often studied as problems instead of people who face problems in their lives. Du Bois was pointing out the Blackness often afforded theorists a problematized moment. Their problematized moment focused on Black people over and against what they may leave. The consequence is that their historicity is robbed of its contingency and collapsed into a necessity. These words coming from Professor Louis Gordon speak to the question of how we want to lend some weight to our lived experience as valid, and also the concept that regulates our being, rather than merely relegating us to a zone of being and non-being, that we ourselves are actually championing alternative visions. And one of those, and it has shaped the contours of scholarship in South Africa in very profound ways, is Afrocentricity. If you go to one of the 23 universities, you will find that whether it's the University of KwaZulu-Natal, UNISA, or even the University of Venda, that the Afrocentric manifesto reigns supreme. And so, having said that, I think it's important that I also say that in my study of autobiography, the one thing that emerged as I was reading, as I ran towards Africa, was that it allowed me incredible purchase in formulating a new concept of allochthonous memory, which is defined as a configuration of cultural memory that finds expression in references that are simultaneously intertextual, transnational, transcultural, and ethical. And so it is that it is possible for us to understand that there's an intertextuality that is much the same, stitched on the experience, the common experience of Black people across the diaspora. This readily calls to mind an intertextual affiliation between James Baldwin's epistle to his son in The Far Next Time, and Ta-Nehisi Coates' exhortation to his son Samori and us, that we must struggle to remember this past in all its nuance, error, and humanity. And that is what I experience when I read As I Run Towards Africa by Professor Asante, because he recounts many experiences that are quite unique and at the same time contradictory, which shows that we are not a monolithic idea of, we're not pursuing a monolithic idea of Blackness. In his memoirs, I Run Towards Africa, he speaks of his interrogation by 3 ZANU officials when he conducted research on David Gweshe in Zavarezhwa in Zimbabwe, where he was viewed with suspicion. So its narrative disavowal, of autocracy is quite clear, that it is not as if everything is supposed to be glossed over, as if there is an unproblematic unity. At the same time, we also have to ensure that we are not, to use the word of Professor Louis Gordon, gleaning from Du Bois, seen as the problematized moment in the reading of humanity. And so, having said that, I'd like to thank everyone here present for making this very important observations around the canon, the theoretical canon, as it were, of Professor Molefi Asante. But I also want to say that there is validity in reading autobiography to further extrapolate from it those moments that theory often misses, because it relates with the Black experience as lived by a scholar. And so having said that, I think it behoves me to thank all of you and to pay special honor to Professor Molefi Asante, who together with Dr. Emma Mazama have done extraordinary work over the years, making it a point that their horse just bolts beyond the university. And right now in public discourse, it is even impossible to imagine decoloniality when there are two schools of thought that are contending within decoloniality that there should be, according to Mignolo at least, a withdrawal from this Eurocentric perspective. There is another voice, Boaventura de Souza, who says that actually we should be re-entering into the family of knowledges. And I want to say that Professor Molefi Asante's work, both theoretical and his work in terms of memoirs, allows us entry into discourses of humanity seen from an African perspective, which in itself generates new alternative ways of moving the center, so that we are actually validated in our intellectual enterprise, that there are new generations of scholars like the Hassa who are actually able to conflate Afrocentricity with decoloniality to enable that epistemic shift that is so necessary at this point in time. Because we know for a fact, some people might have said it, tongue in cheek, but the fact of the matter is a lot of the scholarship that has emerged over the last 8 years, except that of Professor Ndlovuka Jeni, has been overwhelmed by Latin American scholarship. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong about it. But in order to reorientate and ground ourselves so that we are not in another axis of the colonized theoretically, we also have to get back to Afrocentricity and use that as a substratum, as an anvil on which we are shaping new ideas that resonate strongly with our experience. And having said that, I'd like to thank you with the words that Henry Louis Gates had actually articulated some 23 years ago, that through some of these concepts that are peculiarly Black, we demonstrate an ability to inscribe Black difference into intertextuality. It is a kind of revision of precursory text, the text of Du Bois, the texts that are much earlier on celebrated writers such as James Baldwin. We are reinscribing history, inserting ourselves in our knowledge is full on without apology. And for that, I'd like to thank Professor Molefi Asante and everyone here present for allowing me the opportunity to speak with confidence about the Black experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your presentation. I think you probably are the authority in the African world on autobiography, and I always appreciate you so much, Dean Masemola. At this time, our next speaker is Dr. Tavingwa Guacherewe, who teaches African literature classes in the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA. He's also a senior research fellow in the Department of African Languages at the University of South Africa and a former visiting professor in the Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He received his PhD in African Literature and Critical Theory at UNISA and his MA and BA at the University of Zimbabwe. Prior to Cal State LA, he taught in the Department of African Languages and Literatures at the University of Zimbabwe. He is published on Afrocentricity, Pan-Africanism, African literature, and the African Renaissance in the Journal of Black Studies, Western Journal of Black Studies, and South African Journal of African Languages, among many others. Dr. Guacherewe is founding Shanuti of the Zimbabwe chapter of Afrocentricity International and is a keen student of the intelligence of his elders and forebears. At this time, Dr. Guacherewe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asante. Greetings, blessings, and peace fellow panelists, and everybody else in participation. My presentation, I'm excited to be here. And my presentation is basically grounded and inspired by the classes that I teach at Cal State LA and the classes that I taught in Zimbabwe and the various other appointments that I've had in my teaching career. I'm basically into African literature, and it provides, quite great and vast opportunities really for debates on Afrocentricity, Pan-Africanism, and these many other tools that we are creating as African scholars and as African people to extricate ourselves from the tendons and tentacles of Eurocentrism in order to reimagine ourselves as a free, dignified, and authentic, people. So my examples are going to come from that background in African literature and its criticism. Apparently, that's where most of my publications are as well, even as I imagine the African Renaissance and talk about the African Renaissance. All this is grounded in the reading, in the consumption and the interpretation of African literature. And one of the things that you find and the revolution that Afrocentricity brings in our conception and appreciation of African literature is that when you look at African literature, one of the biggest challenges for African scholars of African literature has always revolved around the question of theory, methodology, or approach. And you observe that if African critiques of African literature are not influenced by this or that European, literary theoretical approach, say modernism, feminism, postmodernism, structuralism, post-structuralism, formalism, if they are not influenced or impacted or directed by that, the possibility is that they are also impacted and directed by Marxist, Leninist, communist, and socialist theories of literature. And today, with the emergence of post-colonial studies, post-colonial theory, more opportunities actually have come into play where African scholars of African literature have been central in reincarnating European scholars, European theorists in the study and analysis of African literature. You have all these names like Roland Barthes, Mickey Ball, Michael Bakhtin, and most popularly, Antonio Gramsci. Through post-colonial critical theory, these are finding their way now into the discussion and criticism and appreciation of African literature. So that's quite telling, and it sort of, speaks or evinces the fact that as African scholars, we're not doing enough in terms of generating those critical approaches that we should be using in interpreting our literature and gathering the best stimulus out of that literature. But this really is not the case, because Afrocentricity comes into the picture to fill that yawning academic chasm, that yawning academic gap that seems to, be pushed to the forefront by the tendency and inclination of African scholars of African literature to lean heavily and to borrow rather too extensively from Western canons. I think a telling example of what I'm talking about is to be found when one reads the work of Amuta Chidi, a Nigerian scholar of African literature, in his book, in the introductory remarks to his book entitled The Theory of African Literature, Implications for Practical Criticism. He says that it is paramount that at this point in time, he was writing in the 1980s, that at this point in time, as African scholars of African literature, we should be moving our focus away from bourgeois literary critical intellection to embrace the Marxist, Leninist theoretical, positions of scholars such as Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Terry Eagleton, and many other Marxist scholars, predictably all of them being non-African. And he makes no attempt whatsoever to think that the theoretical standards for African literature are all around him in the works of predecessors such as Fanon, Césaire, Kwame Nkrumah, Du Bois, Chinua Achebe, and many others. So the African scholar of literature, the challenge is really with theory. It also entails that these scholars struggle with finding the appropriate language to make sense of the themes, the contents, the stylistics, and many other things to do with African literature. Thus, instead of reading Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, for example, as an Afrocentric novel, or Ngugi wa Thiong'o's The River Between as an Afrocentric novel, these scholars will conflate everything in these novels into what they call the culture conflict motif, you know, in which the impact of this motif is that the agents of African people seldom gets for grounded as instructive, and Africans are easily erased into oblivion as helpless victims of European cultural and political and economic aggression. The same can be said about the novels of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Most of the times when these novels are read without grounding in Afrocentric theory, it's very easy to simply think of them in terms of how they give provenance to Marxist, Leninist, literary critical principles, or to Marxist proletarianism in African literature. And you also find that the anti-colonial stance, the decolonial stance of these novels, as well as those of writers such as Ferdinand Oyono, who has written novels that I like very much. For example, when you talk of Road to Europe in 1961, he's engaging there the challenges, from an Afrocentric and decolonial perspective that says, there ain't nothing in that place that we need. Everything we need is here in Africa. So when you engage this this anti-colonial stance of these novels, as well as those of Ferdinand Oyono or Sembeno Usman and many others, resoundingly gets divested of its grounding in the culture, in the history and traditions of African people, in order to suit the Marxist template and its emphasis on peasants, the proletariat, the bourgeois, and class struggle. Also, you note that the fact that race is an issue in Africa and African literature automatically gets relegated to the periphery, to the margin, because of such theoretical perspectives and their commitment to directing conversations on African literature from Africa, from African culture as much as possible. So Afrocentricity comes into this discussion because it redirects us to our agency as scholars, to our agency as human beings, as thinkers, as philosophers, as students of our experiences, so we can begin to understand that we are capable of creating these theories that we desire in the interpretation, not just of our literature, but also of our history, our experiences, our religions, our spirituality, and everything that goes into the construction of who and what we refer to as African people together. And I like the way Dr. Asante, dedicates his books. It speaks directly to that fact that everything we need to begin with, the foundation, the centering that we need in order to think creatively, intelligently, and progressively, and in a manner that is liberating, everything we need is in our culture, it's in our history. And when Dr. Asante introduces, or rather dedicates his books, it's quite telling. For example, when you read The Afrocentric Idea, he says, this book is dedicated, quote unquote, to the memory of Sheikh Anta Diop and W.E.B. Du Bois. Then he says, mountains above the valleys, unquote. And further in that book, he says, I do not stand alone in this enterprise. In fact, I'm supported on every side by intellectual ancestors. The tradition of David Walker, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Sheikh Anta Diop, and George James serves as my inspiration. These scholars prepared an entire generation of African intellectuals to examine Africa by listening to the African world voice. Close quotes. That's from the Afrocentric Idea 1998 publication. That reference to understand that we can be grounded in the teachings, in the examples, in the inspiration that we gather from our history. Earlier on, Dr. Simpiwe Sesante quoted Ngugi wa Thiong'o when he said, the past is our collective inspiration. The present is the arena for perspiration, and the future, our collective aspiration. And this is where, Afrocentricity, breaks with established ways of looking at African literature, because it says, let's listen to ourselves and understand the contributions that we can actually make in understanding and appreciating our realities. Elsewhere, Dr. Asante also says, when he talks about these inspirations that come from our cultures and our histories, our civilizations, I'll quote here from his 2007 publication, An Afrocentric Manifesto Towards the African Renaissance. On page 101 of that book, he says, we are caught between the Zambezi and the Limpopo. If we leave the first, we are leaving behind the great Zimbabwe. And if we cross the second, we also leave behind the great Zimbabwe. The resolution of this issue can only come from our cultural center. As we stand on the pinnacles of the great Zimbabwe, we see our world going out to the various ends, but not being defined by one or the other. Emphasis there on centeredness, the emphasis there on grounding in the intelligence, in the teachings and philosophies of African ancients, African ancestors, those who have preceded us and paved the way, the instruction in their accomplishments, in their victories, in their struggles, and even in their failures is all around us for us to be able to realize and make use of. And Frantz Fanon also comes into this picture as if to anticipate these arguments in Dr. Asante's works when he says, now that we're in the thick of the struggle, we must desist from the habit of undermining what the ancestors have accomplished or failed to accomplish before our arrival. So it really is a major revolution that now with Afrocentricity, we are able to stand with our feet firmly placed on the ground, raising our shoulders like two embankments and proclaiming to the world that this is what we are able to do, standing in our culture, our history, our traditions, and finding our inspiration from the contributions of our forebears, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, Walter Rodney, all these, great scholars who have gone before us. And we're not just talking about, Afrocentricity as the only theory that we have created. This theory, the revolution that it is ushered in, has allowed us to create even more theories. So you talk of Clenora Hudson Williams right here, right now, who is going to speak towards the end, or rather at the very end, African womanism. Dr. Molana Karenga, Kawida, all these are theories that are emerging because of the revolution that has been ushered in by Afrocentricity. I am myself experimenting with what I'm calling Afro-triumphalism. I've written bits and pieces and used it, in about 1 or 2 articles as a theoretical paradigm in the discussion of the agency of African characters in African literature. And finds its inspiration from the idea of agency in Afrocentricity. So it's a whole revolution. And indeed, this webinar is appropriately, named an epistemic revolution in Africana studies. And it's all about turning the wheel and, reframing how we look at our experiences. It could be in history, in philosophy, in literature, in biology, whatever it is. Relocating ourselves at the center of our experiences. And nothing could be more liberating, nothing could be more empowering, nothing could be more, inspiring when compared to when people stand in their own spaces and their own histories and cultures. That's my contribution to this webinar. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate, everybody else who has gone before me and everybody else who's coming after me. Thank you very much. I wish and I hope that we'll be able to do more of these things, and also to bring more and more scholars from other parts of the African world. We have started well, I think, because we have African Americans, we have Caribbean, we have Africans from the continent as well. I'm excited to see Dr. Masemola, Dr. Simpiwe Sesante, from University of South Africa, also Dr. Molloy, soon to be Dr. Molloy, you know. So this really is a testament of the fact that Afrocentricity is not just a theory, it is a lived and livable philosophy, you know. And I like this idea because its standards are rigorous, they are scathing and uncompromising. And that's why you see that many people get scared when somebody says I'm Afrocentric. And I like taking it on because I really feel that it's not an idea for the faint. It's not an idea for the faint, because when you say Afrocentric, you are taking a position. And I love that because my father taught me that life is all about taking positions and standing in that space. When I read Dr. Asante's books, he talks about a place to stand. Each and every time he's talking about that. And that's the teaching of my father. Those are the teachings of my grandfather, who never went to school.
Yes.
So when I read Afrocentricity, I'm reading my grandfather's ideas in an intellectual kind of packaging.
That's
you know, right. They've now been processed and given currency beyond the orality that I received them from my grandfather, from my father, you know. That's why I talk about being a keen student of my ancestors and my forebears. And I appreciate this very much. And I hope and wish that we continue to do this. This unity is just beautiful, and I'm thankful for the opportunity. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much, Dr. Tavingwa. Thank you very much. Tatenda, yeah, we are now really getting down to our next presenters. And I'm telling you, this has been a fantastic conference already, and I've just enjoyed listening to everybody. The next speaker is Dr. Daryl Zizwe Poe. He is an Afrocentric social scientist and Pan-African historian. He's best known for his works on Kwame Nkrumah and his specific contribution to African unity and liberation. Poe's book entitled Kwame Nkrumah's Contribution to Pan-Africanism, an Afrocentric Analysis, was published originally by Routledge in 2010. The paperback edition came out in 2010. It was published earlier. And then his text is currently being translated into French. He is an often cited author on information on the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the brainchild of Kwame Nkrumah, an organization that Poe worked within for 25 years after being introduced to the organization by the late Kwame Ture. Poe convened the fourth biennial International Kwame Nkrumah Conference, participated in a number of African Union conferences and other Pan-African conferences organized by the Jopian Institute for Scholarly Advancement. He is professor at Lincoln University, Pennsylvania, teaching courses in the Pan-Africana Studies program. At this time, Dr. Zizwe Poe. Dr. Poe.
Thank you for your introduction, Dr. Asante. This, in fact, is a very great honor to be on a panel with these great, renowned scholars and speaking on a topic that I love to talk about. What I normally do, I stick to my 10 minutes. I would like, though, if somebody, one of the hosts, could just let me know when there's 2 minutes left.
Priscilla, would you do that?
Thank you, Priscilla. Okay, so what I want to do, and I always start my presentation like this because, like most of you, I've been hired to have a job where I talk beyond the time limit. So I always put my summary out there first, and here it is. It's in the chat to everybody. You can see my summary in case you have to get up and do whatever you have to do. You at least know what I wanted to talk about. So can I ask the host, is it possible to share my screen? I'll just try to do it and see if it works. Okay, hold on 1 second. Let me open it up.
Yes. Priscilla, you can do it?
No, I said I cannot.
Okay, well, we can get you to do it. Priscilla, are you there? Okay. Belinda, are you there?
I'm here. I believe that.
Who's the host? Priscilla.
Taharka, can you give him access?
What is it, Taharka, huh? I missed Taharka.
I just did, so he should be able to share his screen.
Thank you, Tar.
Stop on the screen. Okay, yes, so I want to continue. Yes, I want to continue. Thank you very much. Okay, so these are the three main points in my summary. I want to just quickly try to deal with the quest to recognize nominal status. I think that's very important for us. Also to advance Afrocentric historiography, and then the Afrocentric challenge of so-called Stockholm syndrome. I'll try to do this very quickly to allow time, because I'm actually expecting and waiting for Dr. Glenora Williams Hudson's presentation, so I want to get to questions also. First of all, let me start with the first point. A quest to recognize nominal status. You know, for me, Afrocentricity is very important. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in a minute. So I went to dictionary.com because I sent some of my students there to look up Afrocentricity before I discussed it in what I felt would be a more rigorous way with more important information. And then when they went to dictionary.com, they realized that Afrocentricity, the word, had not yet accomplished nominal status. Yes, it's being seen as being connected as an adjective to a number of things and adverbs, but nominal status is very important for words. For those of you who are linguists, you know that the name of something is very important. Even in African tradition, naming is very important. Even in ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, the name was in something called a chenou. The French wrongly called it a cartouche because they thought it looked like a bullet, but it was in a chenou, which indicated that the name was in a circle with no beginning and no end, meaning that it was eternal. So nominal status is important for us. Even our conference is named, starts off with the word Afrocentricity, which the dictionary thinks doesn't exist. Okay, we granted these are power relationships, but the point of the matter is I think we need to make sure that we acquire nominal status every place that we are. Here's another example, for instance, of a lack of nominal status. So I went to Wikipedia and I asked, what is Afrocentricity? And Wikipedia, though I don't consider it an authoritative source on much except sources, also doesn't have an article titled Afrocentricity, with the exception of saying that it was popularized by Molefe Asante's Afrocentricity to text, but it doesn't describe it at all in Wikipedia. Very interesting. So even deeper than that, though, and the reason I came to this is because in my text, Kwame Nkrumah's contribution to Pan-Africanism and Afrocentric analysis, I had to put a whole chapter in there discussing the difference between nominal Pan-Africanism and the adjective of the term Pan-African, because some people think that if there's a game between Brazil and Jamaica that happens in Barbados, that these are the Pan-African games. And when you use it as an adjective, of course, you could see it like that. But the movement of Pan-Africanism, what it meant for African agency, is something that I'm searching for. So I put in the word Pan-Africanism to see what that said. And this is what I got. Dictionary.com, the idea or advocacy of a political alliance or union of all the African nations. And at first I was a little more pleased, except I noticed that it only looks at African nations, that is the organizations of governance in different states in Africa. It didn't look at African people, and it didn't even include African people outside of Africa. So these are some of the terms when you're dealing with undergraduate students and they tend to run to dictionaries to look up some of the terms before they read their assigned reading. This is how they're still not grasping the weight of Pan-Africanism, which first of all, in order to really be Pan-African, has to be Afrocentric, or Afrocentricity, which in order to be understood, you have to have a Pan-African scope across space and time for it. That's the beginning of my discussion, because I believe as people that work in the academy, all of us have a job to fulfill this quest to recognize nominal status. Second point I wanted to make in my 10 minutes. We need to advance his Afrocentric historiography, redefining the breadth of the history we're looking at, the depth of the history you're looking at, and most importantly, which we don't pay a lot of attention to all the time, is optimal agency. Now, those of you who've studied Afrocentric theory understand that agency is one of the cores that we look at. This is what this is the Renaissance. This is what revitalizes the African personage, is the question of agency. When it comes to being enslaved or colonized, what is removed is agency. You don't have the option to make choices about your future. You don't have the options to design the work you do in the present, and you don't have the option to be able to look at your contribution to humanity in the past. So all of that agency is wrapped up, and this is what we mean when we're enslaved or colonized, that our people have lost that agency to decide our future, to understand our past, to perform in the present. So anybody teaching historiography, pay close attention to this, because inside the United States, and I've seen it in a couple of other countries, when we begin to talk about African history, we tend to divide African history up into European constructs of what they considered important. We don't even look at our time constructs. Matter of fact, in a lot of institutions in the United States, an undergraduate can take the history of Africa in 2 semesters. How? This is the oldest people on the face of the continent. How? Anyway, I don't have enough time to go real in depth and tell you all the jokes I wanted to tell you about this, but let me say this. If you're studying the history of African people, if your program is called Pan-African Studies or African American Studies, and when it comes to studying the history of African people, you, 1, restrict it to the United States, and 2, you restrict that to 2 semesters, you are not yet grasping the importance of an Afrocentric perspective. And I think Afrocentric historiography, and on campuses where we have Afrocentrists, they should begin to impact even those history programs that are outside of our purview. They need to change the way that they describe the narrative. It's based on a Eurocentric, what's the latest language I've heard recently from those people that deal with intersectionality? They talk about something called heteronormative. I think what we should do from an Afrocentric perspective is talk about European imperial normatives, because that's what they tried to build into our curriculum for our students to understand. And so when we wonder why, with all of this Afrocentric knowledge that we share with them, why they don't turn out to become Afrocentrists, it's because they have this other narrative built into them, and they seek, even upon graduation, to hopefully be a European imperialist. They don't call it that. They call it classes for success. That's exactly what they mean. Let me go to my third point, and because this is a little deeper, this negotiation of Stockholm Syndrome. I looked this up recently. I presented a presentation at the last DIAP conference on Stockholm Syndrome. And it's really an insulting term in the sense that it only came up in the later part of the 20th century when it dealt with some kidnapping that happened in Stockholm, and the kidnappers kind of began to endear themselves to the kidnapped endear themselves to the kidnappers and begin to want to defend them even against the justice system. This is a sad situation that happens, I think, even sometimes for those of us who are beginning to learn Afrocentric thought. We haven't yet centered our daily life in the situation of African people, first of all, globally, and sometimes even locally. And this is actually a perfect opportunity for me to raise this right now. The kind of dillying and dallying and dancing back and forth with Africans who are concerned about whether Trump will be the next manager of the European imperial process, or whether Biden will be the next manager of the United States European imperial process. Yes, it matters. We should get involved. Agency happens on different levels, at the local level, at the individual level, at broader collective levels. But for us, we have to figure out what is optimal agency. So, with that in mind, knowing that some people may get a little antsy thinking I'm taking the Ice Cube or Lil Wayne posture on the elections, I'm not. I encourage my students to go out and vote for who they think is very important and who will improve the lives of humanity in general, but African people in particular. Some of them are still stuck between the choices of Twiddly-dee and Twiddly-dum, or arsenic and cyanide. Either one you take still may end up killing you. But my job is not to stop them from being active. I think that part of the process of being active, especially if there's somebody there with an Afrocentric mindset, to welcome them after the election, it will allow them to see how to advance their perspective and how to become more useful to the African people in the world. So I say this because I have a lot of my undergraduate students fighting right now to ask me who am I going to vote for. I never tell them because they think that they just have to say that's who they're going to vote for to get an A. But I do tell them to think consciously, and then also to examine the particular bourgeois parties they want to support and what their relationship has been to Africans historically and presently. I think that if we can broaden our scope, a bunch of speakers have said it before this, I think we can begin to see that our concern is what happens in building a strong African nation to protect African people around the world. That way, we won't care who's the president of the United States as long as we have a strong nation to defend us, regardless of who that president is. But without that strong nation, regardless of who that president is, we are seldom served. And so I think that this whole thing of embracing the people that enslaved us and colonized us, not the people solely, but the system that enslaved and colonized us, is a dangerous thing for us to have. We begin to be the main protectors of a system that works against our interests. And I think the other scholars who talked before me said this better. But I think that this is important for us to understand what the Stockholm Syndrome is, this thing of embracing your captors, and begin to talk Afrocentrically about how we can begin to utilize a relationship with all people, but also to free our minds so that the rest of our body can follow and not be so dependent on this enslavement process. So again, let me return to my summary because I'm just done, really. One, we need to constantly fight, as Afrocentric scholars, we need to constantly fight for nominal status of the terms that we think are important. We don't only locate pejorative terms, but we also have to locate empowering terms and use them, because those terms help us to be able to see and imagine a powerful future. Also, number two, the graph and narrative of history must become our story. I work with a man called KRS-One who told me that we should call it our story to make it sound like history. But anyway, our story is the essential part of it. Finally, stop endearing ourselves to Euro-imperial normatives. I support the African people's class. I heard somebody mention class struggle. I think we still should deal with class struggle, but no, not the Marxian terms. We need to deal with the ones that Pan-Africanists, Afrocentric Pan-Africanists had given us in the past. If you want to see what Kwame Nkrumah's definition is of a class, all you have to read is Class Struggle in Africa. It's a skinny little book, but it tells you that a class is really people that are brought together to preserve a certain interest. It doesn't say they have to be this class or that class. And he uses the terminology that he was familiar with then. But we can't be stuck in whatever he was saying. We also have to develop. This is a living knowledge, and it develops as our consciousness develops. I suggest that we look at a term called the African People's Class, and we should explore that concept. The People's Class has been written about in the books written that was circulated by the Democratic Party du Guinea, PDG. And regardless of your concept, your understanding of Sekou Touré, these texts and the explanation of the People's Class deserves a review by Afrocentric scholars. I thank you for your time. I will stop there so I can allow other speakers to have a little bit more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Poe. Appreciate it very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Lewis Gordon, who is professor and head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut at Storrs, where he also holds affiliate appointments in Judaic Studies, Caribbean and Latinx Studies, Asian and Asian American Studies, Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Global Studies. Gordon's research in philosophy is in Africana philosophy, a philosophy of existence, phenomenology, social and political philosophy, philosophy of culture, race and racism, aesthetics, philosophy of education, philosophy of science and technology, philosophy of human sciences, philosophy of psychiatry, and philosophy of medicine, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. His visiting appointments include honorary professor in Uhuru, the unit for the humanities at the university currently known as Rhodes in South Africa, where he was formerly the Nelson Mandela Distinguished Visiting Chair in Political and International Studies. He is the author of many books, including the forthcoming Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, Fear of Black Consciousness. There are many things, many other things. He has a translation in Chinese. He's honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies and a former president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, for which he now serves as its chairperson of awards and global collaborations. At this time, it is our honor and my honor to present to you Dr. Lewis Gordon.
Hotep.
Hotep, Dr. Gordon.
Yes, Sujambo, Mwelweni, Machia Vanakam. I began in mentioning in these ancient languages, and I would also like to begin with my condolence to those of you who have lost loved ones in these difficult times. We know that their passing, from an African perspective, is a form of birth. But we miss them nevertheless, because when you love someone, they're irreplaceable. Thanks to Molefe Asante, Amamazama, Belinda Wilson, and I give a shout out to Molefe's former student, Michael Tillotson. Molefe, as you know, when you asked me to participate in this forum, there was no hesitation. I'll add to that, that although many of you know Professor Asante as the scholar, many of you who have worked with him know the fine human being he is. Among the things I miss about our times together was our monthly luncheon, which will show up with our recent publications and learn from each other. And I'd like you to keep that in mind, because we often, when we speak as scholars, get wrapped in the professional presentation of ourselves. But we forget that we're above all people who fell in love with learning. And learning is part of the human endeavor from the moment the first human being was able to breathe and communicate. In Kemet, many know as ancient Egypt, in Kemet, learning was such a central part of the society because we ultimately realize that a human mode of life depends on it. Now, I noticed the addition, and I'm so happy to see that addition, of Africology in the title of the Temple department. It's Africology and African American Studies. I'll make a comment on the etymology of Africology, okay? Because it's pretty clear if you look at the word, you see Afri for Africa, but you see logos, and a lot of people know that that is a more European term. However, and the European term logos is linked to logging, to principle, to order, to a way of thinking from which we get logic. However, it's not that they invented it, because there were mathematicians and people who were working through logic in Kemet thousands of years before they were done in the European side of the Mediterranean. If we were to make it exclusively an African term, because we already know that Africa, especially if you look at the work of Finch or Massey and others, refers to coming from the Ha, from the womb, from the place of life. And if you think about the ordering of knowledge in Kemet, you could think about the Reket or Rex, and also Sabayet. And roughly translated, one term is a term that refers to knowledge of science and nature. And many of you may not know this, but in ancient East Africa, this was the purview of predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly women. Sabayet means wise teaching. So you could actually say Africa Reka or Africa Rix or Afri Sabayet. But as we know, part of the spirit of generosity is to meet people at least where they're at and move from there. And so Africology will work. Of course, the story I just told presents a very interesting reflection on one of the accusations made against Afrocentricity and Africology, because as you know, once you say anything African or anything Black, you're talking about something in which everyone has an opinion and very few people have the knowledge. And so the opinionated will use all kinds of expressions, in fact, to treat Africology and even Afrocentricity almost as a slur. And among them is the accusations of a robust masculinism. But if one were to look and understand the complexity and what is involved in reaching to a tradition that had its origins of science among the Raket, the people who are predominantly female, one could understand that that reductionism, that accusation is flawed. Now, Africology raises two sets of questions. And the first is the context that raises at least three questions, because we all know this. This is the context in which Euromodernity, Eurocolonialism, European attack on what it means to be human. We are living in the fallout of that. And that generated at least three problematics. The first, the obvious, is what does it mean to be human? Because we, although it's not the case that every African person suffered this, we are dealing with the historical fact that there was an assault on the humanity of African peoples. And this assault took the form of declaring many of us property, and it challenged our humanity. Now, in the midst of that, there's the obvious struggle. And the struggle is for freedom. And we already know, especially when we look at the world right now, the world's full of hypocrites. Because the world is full of people there are a lot of people who extol freedom. They talk about the virtues of freedom. We live in a country that is premised upon a declaration of freedom, while it radicalized the implements of enslavement, degradation, servitude. Now, I only say this because I'm speaking to you from the United States. Many of you are from all over the world. But as we know, all over the world, there is a fascist assault right now on what it is to be human. And the third is from a basic fact. Again, I was in a forum recently called Is the University Colonial? Well, the basic fact is the Euromodern University was created and designed to make rigorous the implementation of colonial practices. And so this leads to a crisis in reason, justification, and thinking. And the crisis, straightforward, is that a lot of science, a lot of knowledge, a lot of techniques, a lot of academic work was rallied for the forces of dehumanization and degradation. So part of the challenge posed by us is to go to the heart of that problem of justification. We ask, is your mode of knowledge, is your mode of presenting reality to us justified? And this leads to a crisis in justification. I was really struck as I listened to some of the other presentations at how wonderfully global the community is. Because as we know, if we're looking whether it's Africans in Africa, where Africans in Africa are indigenous, or if we're looking at Africans in other parts of the world, for instance, if we look at Dalits in Southwest Asia, what we realize is that our plight generates a set of pressing questions. And among those questions is a subtitle of this forum, because the subtitle raises the question of epistemic revolution. And this means it's a question of working beyond the paradigms that dominate theory. And we touched on some of those earlier. We talked about, for instance, decolonial practice. I'm so happy to see some of my colleagues from UNISA here, because UNISA is a decolonial summer school. But what some of you may not know is that UNISA's decolonial summer school took a turn in which it began to address the crucial issue that decolonial thinking is not something brought into Africa. It's actually something emanating from Africa. And you have seen that, you have heard this in some of the reference to the Africans who have argued consistently, not only against colonization, but also about epistemic colonization, which today is called coloniality, well before there was even a world systems theory, a dependency theory. And although he was a wonderful man, before Keanu used the phrase coloniality. And this is not a point to say first must mean better. It's more a question just simply to acknowledge the ancestors who continue to struggle and think. But when we think about this question of decoloniality, we're also thinking about the question of theory. Because you see, what dominates a lot of discussions of theory has been, particularly over the past 40 years, post-structuralism. And within post-structuralism, it's split into two brands, genealogical post-structuralism and critical theory. And one of the things I've pointed out about critical theory is that critical theory is very textual and it's very Eurocentric. So you already know this. If we were to have a meeting right now and said it's going to be about critical theory, you pretty much would have a majority white audience and you pretty much just talk about a group of Europeans. However, if you say decoloniality, you will have a very different audience. And what decoloniality did was to raise the genealogical post-structural move on power, the study of power, and replaced it with coloniality. Now, although it does follow that line of reasoning, there is a difference because we know when we speak to each other, we know when we reach to our communities, how it functions as a gathering notion. And so from us, the question we begin to raise is if we're going to raise the question of meta-theory, the theory about the theory, the question comes, to what extent are we not going to subordinate ourselves as a subspecies of another theory, but take responsibility for theory through which we begin to raise the critical questions to come. Now, I bring this up for a variety of reasons. I bring this up because this comes to my second consideration. And the second consideration connects directly with what could be called African metaphysics and the conception of reality with which we address the first set. You see, epistemological paradigms, the centering of saying it's knowledge by itself, and also a lot of the kind of arguments that some people use, particularly when they're being critical of Africology, is that they presuppose that they, and by they I mean those who formulate things within an exclusively European or Western framework, they presume that to speak in terms of being or ontology is to speak about all of reality. But one of the things we learn right away is that that is based on a metaphysics that separates, that depersonalizes, that treats individuals as if they're gods that control reality. But as we know from many African languages, all the way through to ancient languages such as Medu Neter, what we know is that there's an understanding of reality that's always going beyond itself. In other words, it's a relational metaphysics. It's an understanding that if we're going to deal with reality, we should take seriously that sometimes being or ontological claims actually cover reality. And this then brings us to this question of the insights of what we can learn through opening our language and opening our understanding and our communicative practices, always with humility, through understanding what is always greater than ourselves. There are many people who miss the uniqueness of how the term Afrocentricity is used, or as I was spelling out earlier, Africology is used. Because although it does use terms such as grounding, if we look carefully, there's never an understanding that even the ground can stand by itself. In other words, it is always in relationship with something else. And this fundamental relationality is something we see, for instance, in South Africa, one of my other homes, in concepts such as Ubuntu. But we also see it at the root words in which the reality, the humanity is brought forth in the very act of thinking. And so this brings me to my concluding remark, because it's 10 minutes. When I teach my courses, what I've learned is it's better to demonstrate than to proselytize. And what I mean by this is I always put in the syllabi of my courses right there for the first meeting, a quotation from an ancient African thinker. And I put the date. And we discuss that in the very first class. Because I know that when my students leave the class, if somebody comes and tells them that Africans didn't think, or all ideas come from Europe, etc., my students could easily say, for instance, that Antef was writing in 1900 BCE. And not only that, we discussed it in class, and he was talking about the philosopher. And even when he talked about the philosopher and the thinker, and etc., Antef raised the question of the ancient writings he was reading. And now think about that. If we're reading writings from an African from 4,000 years ago, and there are also she's, a lot of people forget that Nefertiti was an intellectual. She and Akhenaten were the architects of the emanation theory of reality. What they begin to realize is if those people are referring to their ancient writings, then a whole lot needs to be done to understand our relationship to our ancestors and what we're going to offer our descendants. So I conclude with just a brief point. I was delighted to hear earlier that it was brought up that it's misguided to look at Africology as a search for reproductions of ourselves, for mimetic images, for mirrored images, or to put it bluntly, narcissistic performance. What really worries the powers of disempowerment, the people who use knowledge to disempower people, is the ultimate thesis of Africology, of what we call Black studies, but Africology is beyond Black studies. You see, Black studies is a small set of the larger picture of what this is about. And what bothers them is that in order to dehumanize, to disempower, it requires also miseducation and disinformation. And so the ultimate threat is not simply that we're taking responsibility for our ideas, but ultimately, what we are struggling for is truth and knowledge in relation to ethical responsibility for life, or if we think about might, breath. We are struggling for humanity to receive the breath of truth. And it's with that, in the short meeting, I would like to end, because ultimately, the empowerment of breath, of life, and truth, this is what we are drawing from our ancestors to give to our descendants as we fight in these nihilistic times. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gordon. We have one final presenter, and that's Dr. Clenora Hudson-Weems. She is a professor at the University of Missouri. She's author and screenwriter. She is author of 4 Africana Womanism books, including Africana Womanism, Reclaiming Ourselves, Africana Womanist Literary Theory, Africana Womanism and Race and Gender in the presidential candidacy of Barack Obama. Africana womanism, a family-centered Afrocentric paradigm, prioritizes race, class, and gender in the collective struggle of Africans for racial parity. She is author of 4 books on Emmett Till, including Emmett Till, The Sacrificial Lamb, which came from her doctoral dissertation funded by Ford Foundation. She is also co-author of Toni Morrison, First Critical Study of the Works of Nobel Laureate, and is the editor of Contemporary Africana Theory, Thought, and Action. I am happy to present to you Dr. Clenora Hudson Weems. Dr. Weems.
Yes, I better unmute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know how I ended up being the last speaker. I wanted to be the first or the second or third, but I'll take anything, Malefe, to be here with you. So that makes me happy.
Thank you.
I do learn fast, and from hearing the brother from Lincoln speak, and then the one just speaking a few minutes ago about the lessons that we learn, in a sense, from the past and the quotes that we pick up. I thought about the quotes. I love quotes, by the way. But before I get to the quotes that are applicable to Africana womanism, I just want to say this one. You probably remember this, Dr. Sante. You were one of the contributors for Contemporary Africana Theory, Thought, and Action, a guide to Africana studies. At the introduction, I opened up with an African proverb: until the lions have their histories, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. That's why it's important for us to name and define ourselves, because we know the dynamics of our existence, and an outsider doesn't get it. And that's what I have spent my time in making sure that I'm not misunderstood, okay? So let me get to the Africana womanism. Can you hear me? Are you hearing me?
Yes, I think everybody can hear you.
Yes. Oh, great. Okay.
Everybody's muting though, so we won't have any noise in the background.
Okay. First of all, let me just give you a quick definition. Well, let me give you an intro. This is a quote from you, Dr. Sante, Afrocentricity and Transformation. Afrocentricity is an intellectual perspective, deriving its name from the centrality of African people and phenomena in the interpretation of data. Very important. In other words, nomo, the proper naming of a thing. And you talk about that as well, the generative and productive power of the spoken word is very important, because that's how we come to essence and existence. So that's important. Africana womanism, this is my definition quickly, is an authentic Africana family-centered construct. It is the original female Afrocentric paradigm, at least that's what I think, dating back to the mid-80s. It prioritizes race, class, and gender, and offers 18 distinct characteristics of the Africana womanist, who with her male counterpart addresses everyday issues confronting her entire family. It's all about the family, not about the self, in an ongoing quest for total equity for human survival. So we can see right there why the other forms of based constructs or names for the woman does not fit us, because we're family centered. We're not about gender exclusivity or gender first. It's about the family. The 18 characteristics, I'm going to see if I can just give you those quickly. It is, first of all, like I said, self-namer, nomo, self-definer. And I tell my students, if you don't name and define yourself, someone else will. And they usually do a poor job. And of course, it's kind of difficult to take it back. So just make sure you get it out there up front so nobody will misunderstand it. It's family-centered, it's genuine in sisterhood, strong. This is physically and emotionally in concert with the male in the liberation struggle. That is very key, because the outsiders are not looking at that family at every instance. Whole, authentic, flexible role player, respected, recognized, and that's very key. Because I listen to people, you know, who are anti-male, for example, and they say these negative things about the male and says, you know, he doesn't know how to respect me. Well, I tell them it starts at home first. If you want respect, you have to give it. You can't call a person out their name and then expect them to respect you. That's just ludicrous. Spiritual, male compatible, female compatible, respectful of elders. We need to get back to that for sure. Adaptable, ambitious, and mothering and nurturing without apology. People are apologizing for being parents. That's a privilege. And I think that in Africa, when we place Africa at the center of our analysis as Afrocentrics, then we understand that. We don't have a problem and think the kid is doing us a favor. They're going to do their part as long as you do your part up front. Now, just want to start off with a quote, Malefi, again, Dr. Asante, you wrote the afterword to my second book, Africana Womanist Literary Theory, and I shall never forget that. I had so many colleagues saying, why are you letting a man have the last word in your book on Africana womanism or something? I said, why not? First of all, it's my book. And as my book, I decide who's going to be first, second, third, or none. Okay? So yes, he has a lot to say. I have a lot of respect for him, and he can definitely have the last word. But some people don't get that. So this whole thing, in that you make it very clear, and a very clear point, I should say, that we as Africana people too have the right to name and define ourselves. And that's what got me, because that's my whole thing. I'm not piggybacking off someone else's name and coming up with a name for myself. Because if any aspect of that name has already been claimed and defined, you're a part of that too. So you just have to be clean and clear with it. Come up with a fresh name and put in all the tenets that you want. You stated, quote, Africana womanism is a response to the need for collective definition and the recreation of the authentic agenda that is the birthright of every living person. I love that. I love that. That was in 2004. And I remember when I made the first call for Africana womanism in the Western Journal of Black Studies back in '89. I didn't say it like that, but that was on my mind. Because I kept saying, I cannot name myself after something that has nothing to do with my reality. It has nothing to do with my priorities. Not at all. So therefore, it's not going to work. So we look at Africana womanism within the Afrocentric arena. And what do we see? First of all, its contributions to Afrocentric discourse. I look at it via naming and defining Africana women according to our true nature, and explicated the importance of positive male-female relationships for an interconnected, not intersectionality, but interconnected existence in a collective pursuit for securing our birthright to abundance and happiness. That's very important. And I keep saying to people over and over again, if you don't name and define yourself, someone else is. And if you piggyback off of someone else's terminology and going to create and carve out a space for yourself, you're duplicating a duplicate. We've already been here forever. We're already set it up. And anything else is going to be a duplication or an attempt at duplicating what we've already done, which makes no sense in the academy. At any rate, Dr. Ama Mazama, wonderful Afrocentric scholar, she's always there. She goes back when she looks at Africana womanism and takes it back to '87. And she says that I had coined the term Africana womanism in '87 out of the, quote, realization of the total inadequacy of feminism and the like theories to grasp the reality of Africana women, let alone give us the means to change that reality. And that's very important. that reality, of course, is that rift between Africana men and women, commonly, of course, called the battle of the sexes. And indeed, for us, we know it's historically inauthentic. It doesn't work. We have issues and we have to deal with them, but we have to deal with them within our private domain, our own public private space, not someone else dictating to us what we need to be focusing on, what needs to come first, second, and third. We decide that. And so in going back basically to African antiquity, and I'm getting to this whole thing of Africa not having necessarily that problem of male-female issues per se that we see here in the US, until, of course, the advent of colonialism. And when that was brought there, then, of course, there was a breakdown. But going back to African antiquity, you will see that that mindset is non-Afrocentric. For men and women then shared, I believe, that sense of responsibilities, including even power, or powerful, I should say, positions in leadership like kings, queens, etc. And at the same time, they enjoyed and appreciated traditional roles in society because we are biologically different. So we have different roles that we respect, and we have no problems with it. Women are the ones who traditionally, it's getting to be crazy now, but they can have it. We were the ones who had the babies, so men didn't have it next year because you had a year before last. It's always our duty, and we have no problems with that. Now, a global family-centered paradigm, we're talking about Africana womanism, it supports the collectivity of men and women working together to show its applicability to Africana people worldwide. We're showing that we are all the same. Wherever we are, we come together, we interconnect. Okay, this explains why the South African journalist by the name of Gracio Madando, those from South Africa, I'm sure you've heard of her. She's a journalist. She writes for the Southern Times. That's the Southern newspaper in Southern Africa, that whole district. And she wrote an article called Why Africa Relates to Africana Womanism. Okay, and in that article, she justifies this fact that there was a time when that wasn't a problem for us. She notes, quote, unlike the Western-rooted feminist approach to literature, Africana womanism speaks to male and female compatibility, where men and women coexist together without conflict, end quote. She realizes that, again, quote, the real cause of inequalities in Africa is colonialist patriarchal tendencies. And hence, she concurs with you, Dr. Sante, that Africana womanist thought has the perfect approach to gender issues in Africa as compared to American feminism. That, again, came from that dynamite afterthought that you gave to that book. I mean, I use it like mad. So many quotes I get out of there, here and there. At any rate, moving on, I was at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka the year before the first edition of Africana Womanism Reclaiming Ourselves came out in 1993. So I was in Nsukka in 1992 at an international conference on women of African and the African diaspora. And I remember getting back after spending 10 days, I believe I was there, getting back and getting a call from Zula Sofala, who was distinguished as Nigeria's first female playwright from the University of Nigeria, Ilorin. She wrote the foreword to my book, African Womanism Reclaiming Ourselves. But I talked to her when I got back, and she said, you're all in the paper that left there. I mean, I knew that there were some women who wanted to be feminists, and I said, you can be feminist all you want, but I stand over here being the Africana womanist by myself if it has to be. I have no problems, but I was not alone. So she said, all in the paper, it's in the Daily Times, the Nigeria Daily Times. I said, oh, that's your local paper? She said, no, it's like a New York Times. I said, oh, wow. What does it say? She said, how about this? Beyond bra burning, Africana womanism as alternative for the African women. I said, I like that. That was July 27th, 1992. And the article serves, interestingly, to report the activities, the knowledge, and the perspectives shared at the women's conference there in Nigeria. And ultimately what happened is we found that that type of activity or reporting ended up being an endorser of the concept of Africana womanism, and moreover, a contributor in the globalization of the movement or of the theory. And I wanted to read a quote that came from that paper. Personal and racial experience would be the factors responsible for the evolution of Africana womanism. Therefore, legitimate concerns of the Africana woman are issues to be addressed within the context of African culture and history. Africana womanists do not believe in bra burning. I love that. They believe in womanhood, the family, and society beyond bra burning. I always knew that Black women on the whole were not burning their bras in the 60s. They were happy to have them. So this whole thing of freeing themselves in that way, again, it didn't work for us. And I had some quotes that I just want to share, just maybe 4 or 5, maybe 3 or 4. Little quick quotes, little snippets that go way back to show you, I have not created Africana womanism in and of itself. I've said that in several writings. What I simply did was looked, observed us, and saw us going back to our homeland, seeing us act accordingly, with Africa at the center of the analysis. Here goes one in 1890s by Anna Julia Cooper. They have erroneously called her a pre-feminist. She's not, she's more of an African womanist. She says simply, woman's cause is man's cause. We rise or sink together, dwarfed or godlike, bound or free. How Africana womanist is that? Not anti-male, not no. It's not about that. Another one from South Africa, Ruth Mapati, for the South African scholars, you've heard of her, no doubt, who talks about these children, these babies, all dying, and all these decomposed bodies of these kids. This is in the 90s, who were fighting apartheid. And she says the national liberation of the Black South African is a prerequisite to her own liberation and emancipation as a woman and a worker. That makes sense to me. National liberation, that's race person, that's the prioritization of race, class, and gender. That is exactly what Africana womanism is. The Black feminists wanted to say, it's the simultaneity of race, class, and gender. I said, that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as simultaneity. You do first thing first. You open your eyes in the mornings first before you get up. You don't jump all, do it at one time. You do it one thing at a time. So, and the feminists, initially, the traditional feminists always talked about gender exclusivity. So I'm saying that, no, this is something else we're talking about. The national liberation, that's the race factor of the Black South African, is a prerequisite to her own liberations and emancipation as a woman and a worker. And when I read that, I think right away of Sojourner Truth in the celebrated oration, and Aren't I a Woman? Powerful. She's at an all-women's convention in Akron, Ohio in 1852. Among so-called the community of women, one would think perhaps maybe she could be welcome. She's up north in a more like I guess you would call it a abolitionist area. Ohio is that. And she, when she motioned to the front, they began to hiss at her and jeer at her, not because she was a woman, because there were mostly women, there were a couple of men there, here and there, but because she was Black. And it really it really gets me when I hear them calling that an On Our Woman, the feminist manifesto. I say, how abominable. That's her experience. She's dealing with self-actualization. She talks about the race factor first, because before she can begin to articulate her dissatisfaction with this gender issue, she has to, first of all, be a human being. Blacks were considered 3/5 human beings. So she's got to save some space for herself. And that way first, she deals with the race factor first, and then she talks about the class thing that, they say women's supposed to have this and that. No one ever gave me any of that, but ain't I a woman? That race factor first, and then the class factor right behind it. It's not until after those things have been addressed, then she could talk about that little man there who says women can't have as much rights as Christ, as a man, because Christ won a woman. Where'd your Christ come from? Man? No. God and woman. Man had nothing to do with it. The absurdity of it, she talks about. That's in our woman. Self-actualization. So stop calling it the pre-feminist. It's not pre-feminist because it's not gender exclusive. And certainly it's not, they're trying to make it so that it's a little more inclusive. Still, they don't deal with the prioritization of race first, and then class, and then gender. And finally, I have this little quote from LaFond, who is from the Caribbean. She says that Hudson Williams is helping Black women relocate themselves from the margins of white feminism to the centrality of their own experiences. So that Afrocentricity here, that's what we're talking about. Afrocentricity, wherein one places Africa at the center of the analysis. Very important. There was one other thing that I wanted to bring out, and I probably accidentally read past it. Let's see. Well, let me just, because we're running out of time, I know it's getting late. Let me just wrap this up right quickly with something that I absolutely love. I was en route for an engagement at the University of Pittsburgh. This is back in 2009, and had a layover in Milwaukee. And while I was there, those 2 hours, I wrote this poem, 2009, called Africana Womanism, I Got Your Back, Boo. And I'm going to read this to you. My students love it. I read the first 3 lines and they do the I got your back, boo, the last. Don't you know by now, girl, we're all in it together. And we're all hearing that now. But this is written down back actually in the 1990s. Don't you know by now, girl, we're all in it together. Family centrality. That's it. We're going nowhere without the other. That means the men, the women, and the children too, truly connect collectively working. I got your back, boo. Racism means the violation of our constitutional rights, which creates ongoing legal and even physical fights. This first priority for humankind is doing what it must do, echoing our First Lady Michelle, I got your back, boo. That dates it right there. She was the First Lady. Classism is the hoarding of financial privileges we must all have now in pursuit of happiness. Without a piece of the financial pie, we are doomed to have a coup. Remember, protect the other. I got your back, boo. Sexism, the final abominable sin of female subjugation, a battle we must wage right now to restore our family relations. All forms of sin inevitably fall under one of 3 offenses. Africana womanism, I got your back, boo, corrects our common senses. That's the poem that I love. And I want to stop at this point because it's kind of late and I'm thinking that we might have people who might have some questions or some things that they'd like to add to this or to the other speakers. And I don't want to say any more than that. I kept it to 10 minutes, I hope, maybe 15. But that's about it. And I thank you, Dr. Asante, for inviting me here to speak.
Well, thank you very much. And you always try to make sure that everybody is on and they get to say what they want to say, and your words are important to us. And thank you so much, Dr. Clenora Hudson Weems.
Thank you.
Let me just say that our time is really out. We're past 4. It's 4:11 now. We're past 4. But I do want to suggest. I just want to go through what a couple of questions were, and then I want to thank everybody, and we can get off. Well, let me just show you this. We had probably more than 200 people we know, and then this video will be on YouTube. It will probably also, it will be on the YouTube of the department's YouTube. But we had a number of questions. One person wanted to know whether or not anybody had any recommendations for Appalachian University, who's trying to create a program in what they call slavery studies. So,
Oh, slavery what?
slavery studies.
Ugh.
This is beginning talks on beginning a slavery studies program at that. That's crazy to me, but I don't know anything.
Probably in Kentucky, right?
Yeah, somebody wanted Nadia Kova to pronounce her name. And I thought I was doing pretty good, but Nadia, would you like to unmute yourself and pronounce your name?
Yes, you were struggling with my surname, Nadezhda Khokhalykova.
Give it to me one more time.
Khokhalykova.
Yes, nice.
Yeah, I visited Russia.
What do you say, Gordon? Louis, what do you say, Louis?
Oh, I know. I just pronounced her name. Yeah, I was shocked
Say it again.
Khokhalykova. When I visited Russia, I was shocked I could read Russian.
Wow, that's good. Well, the only thing I could say was spasibo.
And I can say, Здравствуйте, как поживаете?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, Nadia did write the first book in Russian on Afrocentricity, and I think
God, good.
Extremely important. Okay, so then there was a question that was asked: how can we promote an Afrocentric approach to replace the Eurocentric view when all our textbooks are using Eurocentric terminology? For example, the African language classifications were created by Eurocentrics and are still used in our schools. Another one was they wanted to ask this question, and that was, let's see what the question is. Okay. That was no question. That was a comment, and would like to ask, what do Africans need? What do we need to propose? Because there was a comment that we don't need to just oppose, we need to propose, but what was it that we should propose? And Rashid Atwater asked a question which I need to talk with him about because I think he's my advisee. And his question was, how does an Afrocentric approach to African phenomena differ from other paradigms under the Black Studies umbrella? We'll talk about that later, right? And then we had let's see, we had some wonderful comments from panelists. Many panelists wrote, including Dr. Noman, Dr. Dove wrote a long comment to a lot of people, and it was very, very wonderful. Okay, so I think all in all, we did a pretty good job, and you guys were amazing, wonderful, and I would hope to see if we could repeat this maybe next year sometime, maybe in next fall, because this was exceptional, and I learned a lot, and it helps me. I just want to say one thing, because I saw my good friend Louis dealing with the question of Africology. Here at Temple, what we say is that Africology is the Afrocentric study of African phenomena transgenerationally and transcontinentally. And what we mean by that is that not that Black people are studied, because Black people have been studied for a long time. Africa has been studied for a long time. But it's the Afrocentric study where we prioritize the agency and the centrality of Black people in our own historical narratives. But we study this transcontinentally, whether it's in the Caribbean, in South America, in North America, in Europe, in Africa, wherever, and transgenerationally, whether it's under, in and 1900 to 2100 BC, or whether it is in 2020. So it's transcontinental, and we say transgenerational because we know that it's a big experience. The human origin is Africa and so forth. And any phenomenon, because it could be a phenomenon, it could be about housing segregation in Mobile, Alabama, or it could be about the various issues going on in Lagos, Nigeria. It doesn't matter. It is the Afrocentric study of African phenomena transgenerationally and transcontinentally. So that's how we say that. Anyway,
I guess the key to that is your own tool of analysis. That's it.
Yeah, well,
your own language, your own tool of analysis. That's the problem, is that people want to obtrude upon you their tool, and their tool doesn't work for our reality.
Yeah, the thing I was hinting at as well, Malefe, is that there has been a form of colonization of theory that would expect Africology to squeeze itself into those paradigms. And I regard Africology as questioning the very notion of being squeezed into those paradigms.
Absolutely.
That's why I wanted to take on that, to point out that the use of the logos was tentative, and that there were African resources through which to deal with the question of intelligibility. That connects a lot with what Dr. Weems was saying, because when I brought up the Reket, for instance, that order of knowledge came out of predominantly female communities. And of course, when we deal with Sabaeat, from which the Greek-speaking people change it to Sophia to Sophia, the main point is that this was not a conception of wisdom and the looking into reality brought into Africa. It was already there. And the thing that's striking is its continued usefulness, because there are certain limitations to the paradigms that would, for instance, lock thinking purely at the level of the visual, as you get with Theoria. And what we understand, of course, is that meaning is not exclusively visual. This is one of the reasons why breath, the voice, is so crucial for meaning in Africology.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that that's very clear. We understood when we were coming up with Africology that there was a slight problem, and you raised it. I mean, it was a real problem. But this is and I think we all as Afrocentrists at least should understand this, that the problem you have with, if we were to say Afro-Reket or Afro-Sabat, within the institution that we live in, it is a much more, it's a harder mountain to climb. You can climb it eventually. Once you got Africology, you can climb it. But we recognized that that was problematic. In fact, our graduate students immediately recognized it and say, well, where are we going to go to? What are we going to do with this Greek term? I mean, where does this mean? And that's why when you were talking, I was thinking that, it would be great for the HBCUs to come up with new names for the disciplines that they have. I mean, this was a suggestion that Sheikh Anta Diop made years ago. He said to me once, he said, why do we say social sciences? He said, Africa, the fundamental unit is the family. Why don't we start with the family sciences? That should be, and give it an African name, you see? But you you hit a very important artery here that we have to work through. And I thank you for raising that and bringing it forward, because you're perfectly correct that Sophia and probably even Sufi all are derived from the ancient Seba, So this is very, very powerful thinking. Look, thank all of you. I just want to,
Can I just add one thing?
Yes.
As I didn't want to talk long, but this whole thing, let me just show you how it doesn't work. You take how so many Black women, first of all, they tried to name themselves after the feminists and became Black feminists, and that's as far as they're going to get. But in addition to that, so many people are using intersectionality. You know, I've been calling it interconnectedness since the 80s. Intersectionality has a entirely different nuance. You come together. This is what it does. It comes, it merges, and then it kind of breaks off and then focuses on this and focuses on that. We don't break off and focus. You know, we'll always be the parent who holds the kid on the hip while you stir the food up. We don't break off. We are interconnected. We are interwoven like fabric. We don't have to break off. That's why it's difficult for me to even imagine using a term that at some point breaks away from that which is very, very essential to your existence. And so it's a lot of that playing on. You know, I got 2 degrees in British Lit. That's the stuff I had to learn, because otherwise it's going to be old white guys, you know. So I'm simply saying that a lot of this, the tools of analysis like deconstruction and all that stuff. I mean, deconstruction doesn't work for Black people, because the beginning of the African American literary tradition was signaled here in the United States with the slave narrative. And the slave narrative has everything to do with your political and social and physical milieu. It has everything to do with your background, you know, who you are. And see, it's apolitical. It's depersonalization. That's what deconstruction. It takes away the personal. It takes away the history. It's ahistorical. That's why it doesn't work for us. It is, all that stuff is very important in coming up with the totality of my existence. It is my past. It is my history. It is my personal. It's all that, not excluding all that. And we can't do that. That's the problem. It's not a problem with me, but that's the problem some people have, because they're using other tools of analysis that weren't designed with them in the mind. That's exactly what feminism was. And we weren't on the table. That's why they can talk about gender exclusivity. We're talking about, no, I got to talk about my whole family, because that's what it's all about.
Well, we can have this discussion for another hour, because I have a whole lot more to say about it myself. But I'm not gonna hold you longer. You've been fantastic. You've been a great audience, and those of you who are in, I mean, if Noman is still here from Bangladesh, it was 12 a.m. when he started, and it's probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning for him. And I'm sure for Nadia in Moscow, and for the people in South Africa, it is about 8 or 9 hours away. So anyway, thank you. And those in California, Tavingwa, you're just beginning your day. So anyway, you know, thank y'all very much. And I appreciate all of you. Love all you guys. Y'all are great. Louis, it's good to see you. You're looking great, man. Take care. All right.
Great to see you. Much love to everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See. Leave.